Welcome back to all participants and esteemed speakers to our second day of Privacy Symposium 2021, a maiden event organized by Infosys Data Privacy Office in collaboration with International Association of Privacy Professionals. I am Rajesh Kumar, the Group Manager with Infosys Data Privacy Office, will be your MC, a host in the session for today. Another round of interesting topics, discussions by esteemed speakers, providing valuable insights for the audiences who are participating today with a literal takeaway from our day-to-day practices. And today's theme is primarily more on artificial intelligence and data ethics, one of the most hot-selling kit in the current market. We will also be celebrating today this event, contributing towards the diversity aspects where the speakers mostly for women, except me and Brent. So you will see women speakers on the call, and also to all the other women speakers, women professionals who are working in the field of privacy. We dedicate to this. So the topic we would be listening is worth introduction using some of the quotes which are given by researchers available on public domain. I'm sure you would all heard about this quote. AI goes above and beyond our human intelligence, or AI mimics humanity, and this is or AI can eliminate human biases. There's one best quote which was given by one of the famous entrepreneur Elon Musk on AI's lack of emotion. So if I need to expand this code, it's more like AI doesn't have to be evil to destroy humanity. If AI has a goal and humanity just happens to come in the way, it will destroy humanity as a matter of course without even thinking about it. No hard feelings. It's a one interesting scope, and there's no such thing as evil AI. So interesting ones, interesting piece, and this is one particular area which is going to change the face of several organizations, several mankind, and it is going to have a huge impact in the market. So now your topic is artificial intelligence versus human behavior. What can be done right? So I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce the moderator of this session, Sarah M. Watson. So Sarah M. Watson is a technology critic and senior analyst at Insider Intelligence. She covers connectivity and tech with a focus on data privacy and policy. Her intersectional work bridges industry policy and academia. Her writing appears in The Atlantic, Wired, The Washington Post, State, Motherboard, and other publications. Sarah has been a fellow and affiliate with Beckman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, and a research fellow at the Tow Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University. She holds a master's in science and social science of the internet with a distinction from Oxford Internet Institute, where her award-winning thesis examined the personal data practices of the quantified self community. She graduated from Harvard College, magna cum laude, with a joint degree in English and in American literature and film studies. Her interdisciplinary work continues to draw from media studies, science and technology studies, anthropology, and literature. So a hearty welcome to Sarah. I'd like to come on the screen and introduce her panel members to the call.
Thank you, Rajesh, for that detailed introduction. Thank you for having me today. I am delighted to be your moderator for this session with two fantastic leaders in privacy. One, Lauren Reed, who is a privacy and digital ethics consultant. You may know her by her handle, the Privacy Pro. And today, stepping in for Professor Sandra Wachter is her colleague from the Oxford Internet Institute, my alma mater, Dr. Brent Mittelstadt, who is a senior research fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute and a Turing fellow at the Alan Turing Institute. So I just want to say for the audience tuning in, this is a live event, so please remember to drop your questions into the Q&A function in the corner of your screen, and we will be fielding those questions to the panelists throughout our discussion today. So don't be shy, just drop those questions into the Q&A. So as Rajesh set us up today, our session is really titled, Artificial Intelligence Against Humanity or Versus Humanity. But I think for us, when it comes to the privacy-related stakes in artificial intelligence, I think the big tension on everyone's mind these days seems to actually kind of center around something more specifically articulated as a question of how algorithmic decision making comes in conflict with our personal autonomy. So more simply put, these are questions about fairness. Obviously, we've all heard about fairness, accountability, transparency, and explainability as being part of the AI kind of a way to address bias. So I think today, we're largely going to focus on the question of fairness and how that kind of intersects with these questions of bias. So, we end up asking questions about what is our ability to, for redress when an AI-driven decision tool gets us wrong in assessing our creditworthiness or our fit as a job candidate. Or what tools do we have as organizations to audit our systems for algorithmic bias or measure for fairness in the decision-making systems that we have? So our panelists today have been asking these very difficult questions with an eye towards not only these theoretical and philosophical questions at stake when we're talking about AI versus humanity, but these folks are actually putting forward some really concrete solutions and frameworks for tackling these questions in practice. And so our panelists' work has already been, translated into bias checking systems used by big tech firms that are supporting AI, for example. So really concrete, but really important questions that we're going to get into today. So I want to jump right in. Brent, your work at the Oxford Internet Institute has really explored how concepts in fairness in the law don't necessarily match up with the kind of technical or engineering measures of fairness. I'm wondering, and we've also talked about the idea that fairness is even more difficult to define across cultural contexts or jurisdictional lines. So I'm wondering if you could talk us through that kind of mismatch and how you've started to try to propose a way to close the gap there.
Yeah, I'd be delighted to. And I should say that when I'm talking about the law, I'm talking primarily about EU and UK non-discrimination law. And there's a couple of distinctions between those frameworks and other frameworks, say in the United States in particular, that I can mention later, but just to make that clear. And so, yeah, what we found in our work is that, there's huge numbers of what we call fairness metrics that have been proposed in the technical literature. Essentially, these are ways of measuring fairness in the outcomes. So when you make a set of algorithmic decisions and then look at the outcomes the different people or different groups receive, how do you actually measure fairness among those decisions? And so there's all of these metrics, and what we found is that there's no single metric that can match with how fairness is understood in the law or how fairness is practiced in the law. Sort of unsurprisingly, there's not a clear sort of test or a clear threshold or a clear metric in non-discrimination law itself. Rather, it's something that is decided. So what is fair is decided on a case-by-case level or a national, regional, local level. And so our basic thought, and I think it's uncontroversial, is that rather than looking at AI and basically work that tries to make AI more fair, tries to measure fairness in AI, rather than looking at that as a way to automate fairness or to have decisions that will automatically be guaranteed to be fair across all the people that receive them, we should think rather about how we can facilitate those local conversations around what is fair in a given context. And so this speaks to different understandings of fairness across different sectors, different countries. Basically, AI should be there to help that conversation rather than to provide an answer to it. And so what we did was propose a fairness metric called conditional demographic disparity that essentially helps start that conversation. So rather than focusing specifically on, what set or what threshold of decisions, say Group A, Group B, Group C should actually receive, it focuses the conversation more on what do you condition your fairness test on? So what is the sort of local attributes that you find particularly important that you think should be at the center of your definition of fairness? And the way to think about using it, this isn't something where you give the metric to your development team, you say, here, use this, everything's going to be fine going forward. It's more that you have this test in place. It produces a set of statistics that you give to people involved. So you give it to the developers, you give it to judges, you give it to the people affected. Basically, it can be shared with whomever you like. And it provides a baseline. It provides some evidence that everybody can work from to compare outcomes between groups. And again, have that local conversation about what is actually going to be fair. And really, to us, that's the only way forward, because that's literally what non-discrimination law requires. It requires you to have that case-by-case approach.
Great. Lauren, in your consulting work, I know you've been working very closely with enterprise clients who are also trying to kind of close this gap between how you think about fairness or how you define fairness. Can you talk a little bit about, those disconnects that you're seeing with your clients and how you kind of push them to articulate that fairness metric more clearly?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I think when we talk about how this works in industry, I always start with the question, what are you optimizing for? And I think that transparency is a huge part of fairness. I'm in Canada and I'm in Toronto, and we have some, I think it's a unique place to think about digital ethics and data ethics and fairness because it's such a diverse place. And so there's no such thing as a set of ethics in Canada, right? There's all these different subcultures and subgroups of people with different, ideas about how things should be and what does discrimination even mean. And so I think that the way to enable, maybe not accomplish, but enable fairness and facilitate outcomes that are fair is to be transparent. And so it's to talk about trade-offs. And so when we ask people, what are you optimizing for? I try to keep people separate so that they're not biased in the way that they answer, and say, what are you optimizing for? Sometimes you talk to the CFO and you know the answer to that. In a publicly traded company, you know the answer to what you're optimizing for is profit. And say it's an algorithm about who gets a loan, as an example. And then you ask somebody who's a mid-level manager, and you might get an answer like, well, we're optimizing for, you often don't get profit as the answer to what they're optimizing for. You're going to get accuracy. They want to complete this task on time and within the budget. And then you get down to, say, a developer to say, what are you optimizing for? And they're giving you very granular answers about how they expect this model to work. And so I think that when we think about human bias and human behavior, it's not just about, what's it replacing? So maybe we think about human behavior, as Rajesh was saying at the beginning, as something that introduces bias into the outcomes. But human behavior is definitely introducing bias into the process that gets there. And so causing people to think about what are you optimizing for, it's really uncomfortable. And it's really, really uncomfortable to suggest that they publish that or share it. Culturally here in Canada, it's very awkward to say we are optimizing for profit, right? When we're thinking about who deserves a loan, the answer is the shareholders of this financial institution. That's who we're worried about or we're thinking about when we make those decisions. And so to propose that people are transparent about this, when you go to what are the incentives, it's so uncomfortable and there's just no appetite for it. It's not going to happen. We require that financial institutions are transparent about their risk appetite, about their governance models. We have an excellent, well-regulated, very strong financial services industry here. But fairness in machine learning and AI isn't there yet, but I think there's potential.
I mean, that's great. I think I love that question, asking, what are you optimizing for from the get-go? Because I think there's so many assumptions built in, that are unexamined. And I think that question really forces all the stakeholders to kind of answer that question and confront those assumptions right off the bat. Brent, I wonder, some of this what we're talking about is like kind of questioning the assumptions of like fundamentals of capitalism underlying this. There's something about, even some of these fairness metrics introducing or keeping status quo consistent, right? And so, Brent, you've talked about kind of bias preserving versus bias transforming fairness metrics. I wonder if you could get into that a little bit in detail.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is really where we come to the difference between, say, EU non-discrimination law, US anti-discrimination law, and to be fair, just non-discrimination frameworks across the world. And so this distinction, as you pointed to, between bias preserving and bias transforming metrics, the basic idea there is that you have certain metrics that will take the status quo for granted as neutral. It will see the status, these metrics will see the status quo basically as a neutral starting point to measure fairness going forward. Bias transforming metrics, on the other hand, are just metrics that don't do that. They don't take the status quo for granted. They don't treat it as this neutral starting point. And what we find is that that distinction basically maps onto the distinction between what we can call formal equality and substantive equality in the law. So formal equality, very simplified version of it would be that we're going to treat everybody equally going forward. So, if you do fairness through blindness, for example, if you don't pay attention to protected attributes and you say we're just going to treat everybody as a group where everybody is the same and we're going to try to treat them fairly going forward, this would be the idea of formal equality. It's also called procedural equality. It's equality in procedures where you're making decisions. In contrast to that, substantive equality says that you have to, what you're trying to do is give everybody an equal starting point for a race, for a race. So you wouldn't put people that have been historically disadvantaged in the same situation as somebody that's had advantages throughout their entire life and expect them to be able to perform the same. So in deciding what is equal or what is fair, you have to take those historical inequalities into account and say redefine your decision-making criteria. So, for example, this could be you redefine the job criteria for a job you're hiring for. You change the criteria for admission to university. You put, say, less emphasis on standardized tests. Basically, what you're trying to do is find ways to make decision-making procedures more fair, taking into account those historical inequalities. And so what we see is that in general, and again, this is a generalization, so there is a lot of detail missing, but in general, anti-discrimination law in the US is much more focused on achieving formal equality, so just treating everybody the same going forward. Whereas European non-discrimination law is much more focused on substantive equality and actually trying to make a fair society, taking those historical inequalities into account. And this is where you start to connect back to, okay, what are the duties of a company, of a public company? What are called in the law positive equality duties? So, for example, do you have a duty to offer more loans to people that may not be profitable in your assessment, but have been historically disadvantaged for other reasons, and therefore you're trying to correct for that historical disadvantage? And that's really, I mean, this is a huge conversation. This isn't just limited to AI. What the positive equality duty should be for companies across different sectors, for public organizations across different sectors, is a huge conversation throughout Europe. And AI is now just playing into that in the sense of, well, if you're using AI, maybe you will have a duty to make it more fair towards certain groups or beneficial towards certain groups, again, to live up to this positive equality duty. So yeah, that's the basic idea of bias preservation in machine learning is if we're not careful, we may end up using these metrics that are essentially freezing the status quo and taking things for granted that, society is essentially neutral or fair when in fact we know it's not. And so we advocate, at least in Europe, to adhere to the law, to use bias transforming metrics if you're going to do any sort of decision making. In other places, bias preserving metrics may be more acceptable.
Yeah, I mean, that really gets into this, foundational question of, what are we optimizing for? Are we trying to kind of push the limits of what equality looks like or what fairness looks like, or not take those for granted? And I think that's super important. Brent, you kind of talked about what the role, how that translates into how a company might actually turn that into something concrete. Lauren, I'm wondering if you could kind of touch on the idea that, this is a really hard thing for companies to wrap their heads around. Like, how do you even begin to report on the fairness or the transparency of your company? What are some of the things that you walk your clients through?
I'll talk about one of the barriers, data protection law and privacy law. We have this, we automatically, whether you're in Canada or the EU, in the EU, you have special categories. In Canada, you have sensitive data. And we have this aversion to collecting it. We automatically say that, and it's rooted in anti-discrimination, that we have these protected classes. And so we shouldn't collect data about race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, and so we start with an assumption that we shouldn't collect that unless we absolutely need it, because it could be used to discriminate against people. And I think that what that prohibits us from doing is be able to measure discrimination. So here in Toronto, at the beginning of the pandemic, they were collecting statistics about positivity and testing. The whole world is collecting statistics about COVID-19 and where it is, and how bad it is, and how big it is. But the city of Toronto started to calculate just only one metric, which was race, and immediately discovered that there's a huge disproportionate impact on people of color with the pandemic. But in proposing that, people were offended, that not beyond just the people who are racist and don't believe in privilege. People were deeply offended that you would collect race data. Like, you shouldn't do that when someone's just coming to get a COVID test. But then the results show a problem, which I think is the first step in addressing it. And so it's the same thing within companies. And within the public sector here, at least if there's a mandate to collect the data, you can. We're under a consent-based regime. So you have to have explicit consent to collect that data. And I think for very good reason, historically, people don't want to provide it unless it's mandatory. And so I think that's one of the biggest barriers for companies, is they don't have the data to show that there is bias. So it's just a matter of, who's making the decision. And honestly, the people who are making those decisions are not diverse at all. On what are the problems here and how do we have to solve for them. And people who are making those decisions aren't personally incentivized to push for that. And even if they were, they would run up against privacy law and say, well, we can't get the data, so we don't have, we can't show the problem.
Right. Well, and it becomes this question of you can't describe the problem, you can't explain the problem without the kind of concrete details. Brent, I feel like there's been ways in which companies often also hide behind the kind of trade secret version of that, like protecting their proprietary systems, or also hiding behind the kind of complexity of AI systems. So not being able to explain why something is happening in an AI output because it's just too complex. Are there some kind of concrete tools that your work has explored to actually kind of address this explainability problem? I'm thinking in part to counterfactual explanations.
Yeah, for sure. So in our work, we've proposed a method called counterfactual explanations that should say it's been adopted by a number of companies. So it's built into TensorFlow, for example, now. It's built into Google Cloud. I want to say that Vodafone has used it, IBM, HSBC, I think have used it as well. So it's something that's out there. And the basic idea is that it would be an explanation that sort of sets aside the complexity of these black box systems and produces a statement that is easily understandable for everybody, for non-experts, for developers, for everybody. And the idea is it's an explanation about a counterfactual world. So if we use the loan example, the type of explanation you would get would be an explanation as to what needed to be different about your case in order to have received the loan, assuming that you did not receive the loan. And this sort of matches with what we expect about explanations in general. We tend to ask questions when we find that something unanticipated or unexpected or just odd has happened. And so this type of explanation deals with those cases. It's giving you an explanation about what would have needed to be different to have received the outcome that you had actually hoped for from the beginning. So that's, you want to be seen as a low risk borrower. You wanted to receive the loan. How could you have actually gotten that decision? And so we just look for essentially changes, the closest possible changes to your case, the smallest possible changes to your case that would have led to you receiving the outcome that you wanted. So this could be, we tell you if you applied for a loan, if your income had been £30,000 rather than £25,000, the system would have actually given you a loan. And so the idea is that you can compute lots of these explanations and give them to people, and they don't tell you, the whole story about how the system is working, but they're giving you some sense of how your particular case was decided. And we think that's really what people tend to be more interested in, is how their case was decided rather than how the black box as a whole works. And so you could apply this to problems of fairness and say, look for counterfactuals that deal specifically with protected attributes or with known proxies of protected attributes. If we changed your gender in the system, your ethnicity in the system, changed your postcode in the system, would that have actually led to a different outcome? Or is there a world in which you would have received a different outcome where that was actually a relevant factor? And so for us, that strikes a good balance between publishing everything, publishing the source code of your system, or sharing all the data that you're using to train the system or run the system, which can carry its own sort of privacy concerns, of course, and instead gives people a way to essentially test the system, and get explanations that are relevant to them without revealing everything about how the system works. And I should just say, I think that aligns pretty well with, we have this draft AI regulation in Europe now. I think it aligns pretty well with the approach taken in there. There is some talk in there of basically trusted third parties getting access to systems to audit them. But in general, you can see that there's still this tension between intellectual privacy and transparency. And honestly, I don't think that's going anywhere anytime soon. So I think we will need these sorts of methods. And just to very quickly speak to what we were talking about before, I should also say in that regulation, there is talk of giving companies more access to sensitive data specifically to test their systems, essentially by creating regulatory sandboxes in which you can get access to protected data, use it to audit your systems, test for bias, test for fairness, these sorts of things. And that, we can have different views on how helpful that will be, but I think it's important to remember that it's not just a case of if we have more data that's going to solve the fairness problem. There are huge gaps in data in terms of representativeness that exist for good reasons or for reasons of inequality, where if you don't address those things first, if you don't address the underlying cause of the problem, but rather just the symptom, you're going to get a system that is more representative, but it's just representing the unfair society as it exists, rather than actually fixing it. So I think I'm always cautious about saying we just need more data to test systems. We do need more data on protected attributes to do bias tests, but it's not the answer in itself.
Thanks, Brent. I'm wondering, some of these tools that you've talked about, or these kind of interventions, they're not just academic concepts in a paper, right? They're actually getting translated and built into the tools that, the industry is actually deploying. So could you talk a little bit more about that relationship? I think that's a pretty unique and quick turnaround, relatively speaking, in the grand scheme of academic publishing on these topics. So I'm curious if you could get into that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, to be honest, to be perfectly transparent, we were just as surprised as you that it was picked up so quickly, because we didn't partner with any of the companies that picked it up at any point. The teams that were working on fairness or transparency within the companies just picked it up and ran with it. So I mentioned counterfactuals. They're built into those different Google products, Vodafone, IBM, and so forth. Conditional demographic disparity, that's now built into Amazon Web Services. So they have this new bias testing toolkit that's available to all their customers called SageMaker Clarify. And so now that's one of the metrics that you can use if you're working with Amazon Web Services, or if you're one of their customers. And I mean, it's great that these tools are being implemented. You know, we propose them, we hope they have real world impact, and so far they are. But I think it's also important to remember that, you know, just having those tools in place isn't a solution in itself. We need to make sure that they're used in the way they're intended. You could use counterfactuals, for example, to mislead people very easily. It could be that you have a decision that is based on where somebody's ethnicity was actually a significant factor in the decision. But if I give you counterfactuals that are only dealing with things like income, the number of cars you own, you know, things like that, these seemingly neutral things, I can give you the false sense that the decision was completely fine, ethical, legal, when in fact what I'm doing is essentially misleading you. So it's not just about the tools, it's also about making sure those tools are used in the right way. And hopefully that's where you get tie-in with regulatory frameworks and also, you know, codes of conduct, self-regulation, those sorts of things, to make sure that they're being used in a robust, honest, and truthful way.
Lauren, I'm curious, you know, on the industry side of things, how do you see that connect between, you know, these are very complex problems, and, you know, the many different stakeholders are trying to tackle them. How do you see that kind of translation of, you know, these more conceptual and policy-driven tools actually filtering into practice?
I think we have to meet people where they're at, or organizations where they're at, honestly. I find, you know, I consume a lot of information and news and articles about fairness and people calling for fixes. And I hear people calling for, well, we need more education for computer scientists need to learn more about ethics, and ethicists need to learn more about computer science. And, you know, companies need to invest. Like, I think that in the meantime, we can't wait for that to be possible, I guess. We can't wait for that ideal situation where, you know, the CFO understands how algorithmic bias works. I don't actually think that's a necessary thing. Sorry, that's my assistant barking in the background. So I think that when we're talking about meeting companies where they are, I don't work with I don't usually work with the Vodafones and Amazons and Googles. I'm working with some companies that have a lot of influence, but you've never heard of them before. They're in the back-end systems of like entire financial systems around the world. And I think that one of the things, like I said, transparency is really key. And accountability within the supply chain is also really key. You have these service provider organizations, and they're saying, well, we're a data processor. We're just here to do what our customers want us to do, right? The customer said they want us to do X. We do X. We're not accountable for the outcomes of that. The companies are saying, we don't have the expertise to do this in-house, so we need to hire somebody who does. So here's the outcome we want. You guys program that. And so I've worked with organizations on both sides of that relationship, and they're kind of, you know, pointing at each other as to who's responsible and accountable for this. And so I think that I'm not sure that regulation's the answer, but I do think that what I've seen in other aspects of regulation, like financial regulation, is that guidance from regulators that comes out is treated as law, but it's more flexible and it's useful. And so I think that guidance on how to be transparent and who is accountable would go a long way. And I don't necessarily think it's data protection regulators that guidance needs to come from. I think it's the industry regulators, whether it's in healthcare or financial services. I talk about that all the time because most of my clients are in financial services, but anything, you know, telecommunications or, you know, any industry at all, I think we've got to start seeing guidance from those industry regulators, because I also think that the decision makers maybe listen to them a little bit more. They don't think, oh, well, data protection, that's the chief privacy officer or the DPO's job. So that's what I'd like to see to help the companies that are really far off from being a Vodafone or an HSBC, and these really responsible, companies that are setting that example.
So we have a few more minutes left, and I want to make sure we get a audience question in. So, Lauren, you talked a little bit about diversifying teams, and I'm wondering if you could both kind of chime in and say something about, what a diverse team looks like, and how you kind of intervene in addressing that question. Lauren, do you want to kick us off?
I don't know, honestly. I don't, other than, I hear a lot of things that don't work, like complaining about the pipeline. There's just not enough qualified people to hire. I hear that all the time. And I think that one of the things that one of the companies that I work with that I think does an amazing job, the chief data officer hires people that are mid-career. And so it's about what skills can you bring. It's not just about diversity in terms of gender or race. It's about diversity and perspective. And so she hires people who are further along in their careers in something else and teaches them how to think about this. And that brings a lot of valuable insights into the team. Even if it's an all-female team, you get diversity of perspective if they come from different socioeconomic backgrounds or different disciplines. And so I think that that's a step that I've seen work, but just my experience on the ground, I wish I knew the answer to how to get more diverse teams. There's a lack of them though, for sure.
Brent, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with a lot of what was just said. It's not solely about, say, diversity of attributes or diversity of groups. It's really about diversity of perspective, because what you're trying to combat is essentially groupthink. It's, there being a predominant culture where certain things are taken for granted, such as this background optimization solely for profit, and where you have people that are both capable of critical questioning, but also feel comfortable and protected and okay with critically questioning. We've seen Google fail miserably at that recently, in quite a public way, and I think that goes hand in hand with just what the team looks like in terms of their makeup. I mean, I haven't worked in industry, so it's difficult to speak about what it would look like in practice for development teams. But at least in my research group here at the Oxford Internet Institute, the Governance of Emerging Technologies group, we look at diversity in terms of discipline. So we approach essentially problems of AI, emerging technology, regulation, governance, that sort of thing, from the perspectives of ethics and philosophy, from law, and from computer science. And honestly, I mean, we have a team that works quite well together coming from those different disciplines, basically because we're very patient with each other. We're willing to explain what we mean by, certain terms that would be taken for granted. Our computer science person is extremely patient with Sandra and I in terms of explaining technical things, which is, I can't stress that enough. That's invaluable. But yeah, it's really through the combination of those disciplines where we've been able to create things that I think that's the reason that they get adopted, is because it's not just a technical fix, it's the technical fix that actually speaks to what's good in terms of ethics and also what's legally required in terms of the law. So I think that's a really disciplinary diversity of perspective is really what to focus on.
Well, I feel like that's a great spot to wrap up, because I can affirmatively attest that the disciplinary diversity of the Oxford Internet Institute is highly valuable and something I personally have benefited from. So that's a great place to wrap us up. Thank you both for joining us today, and thank you to the audience for tuning in. And with that, I will hand it back to our session leaders. Thank you
so much.
Thank you very much, Sarah, Lauren, and Brent for such valuable insights. Some of the few takeaways I would like to just recap a part of the session. I mean, the session had a very interesting analysis of the anti-discrimination, how the bias works, preservation works, a comparative analysis between the US and EU. One of the key points, defining the decision-making criteria depending on the usage. I think Brent, you put it right onto the point. I think this needs a constant evaluation. When AI needs to be used and specifically to meet certain purposes, and also the data collection practices and basis on certain information trends which Lauren had brought it was sensible and very great. So we'd like to thank you for this opportunity and being on it, and was able to give valuable insights on this topic. Thank you again for it. Now going on to the next session is intelligence and data ethics being one of our key topics. The theme on today's session is it is rapidly growing in its capability, impact, and influence. As designers and developers of AI systems, it is an imperative to understand the ethical considerations of our work. I mean, it's mostly the tech-centric focus that which resolves around improving the capabilities of such intelligent systems, which doesn't sufficiently consider human needs. So AI systems, which means it needs to remain flexible enough to undergo a constant maintenance and improvement as ethical challenges are covered and remediated. So ethical decision making isn't just another form of technical problem solving. So I think this is one of the most important, which is as an ethical human-centric AI must be designed and developed in a manner which is aligned and to the values and ethical principles of a society. I think some of it was really covered in the previous discussions. So now we have a topic is on ethical AI by design, how responsible AI yields a brighter tomorrow. So Ilona Logniva is the moderator of this particular session. So just to give a small brief intro about her, she's a graduate of Columbia University, where she was a joint major in economics and philosophy and received her BA in 2007, and of the Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law, where she was a Dean's Merit Scholar and received her Juris Doctorate in 2011. During law school, Ilona worked with the in-house legal groups at Koch, Channel, and JP Morgan Chase, one of the biggest names. Following law school, she started her career as an investment bank legal and compliance associate at JP Morgan and Chase, and then moved to a private practice at Hunton and Williams LLP, followed by 4 years as a corporate associate at Fried Frank Harris, Shriver and Jacobson Law Firm, specializing in leveraged finance, and senior counsel with Enterprise Partnership Group at MasterCard. Currently, she is the Associate General Counsel for McKinsey & Company. So a kind introduction. Ilona, session is over to you. You can please introduce your panel members to the session. Thank you.
Fantastic. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Rajesh, for that very kind introduction. It's fantastic to be here today and really exciting to join this discussion with industry leaders and with my fellow panelists here and friends, I should say. Allow me to take a brief minute just to introduce the panel here. So we have myself. I had a very warm introduction from Rajesh, and We have Erin Abrams, who is the GC of VIA. We have Elise Hulick, who is Senior Vice President at MasterCard. And we have Julia Reese, who is a data scientist also at VIA. That's a very high-level introduction. So if I can hand it over to my fellow panelists to do a more in-depth introduction of themselves, and then we'll kick off and get started. Erin, I'll hand it over to you to kick us off.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Alana. I'm Erin Abrams. I'm General Counsel at VIA. Some of you may have heard of VIA, but if those of you have not, happy to introduce the company and the product to you a bit as well. We are a pioneer in the transit tech category. So we use new technologies to power all sorts of public mobility systems. That can be anything from optimizing networks of dynamic shuttles and buses, creating new networks for wheelchair accessible vehicles, providing our services to operate school buses, and also powering autonomous vehicles around the globe. So our mission is to build the world's most efficient, accessible, and sustainable transportation network for all different types of riders. We operate consumer services, but we also license our on-demand transit technology to public and private transit operators around the world. So cities, universities, hospitals, corporate campuses, municipalities, anyone who needs to move people or things from point A to point B, our systems can help you get there.
Fantastic. Elise, over to you.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Elise Hulick. I'm a SVP and Assistant General Counsel for the Privacy and Data Protection Program at MasterCard. We're a global technology company and payments network. Working on a whole lot of really interesting things. I was very interested in the prior panel and the items that they were touching on, because I know we're going to be covering a lot of that here as well. In my practice at MasterCard, I focus on the North American markets, the Latin American and Caribbean markets, and then I have global responsibility for certain enterprise-wide products like open banking, digital services, our labs initiatives with fintechs, different things like that. So lots of intersection with AI. That I'm excited to talk about with you today. Thanks.
Fantastic. And Julia.
Hi, my name is Julia Reese, and as Erin mentioned, I'm a data scientist at VIA. I've been there for about a year and a third, I would say. And I'm coming from an academic background in engineering, civil engineering, and infectious disease forecasting. So looking forward to talking.
Excellent. And just to say a little bit more about my own background. So right now I am Associate General Counsel at McKinsey & Company based in New York. And I work quite a bit with AI, machine learning, and emerging technologies more broadly, just to navigate the risks and identify some of the key issues for consideration. I also work quite a bit with cloud and working through any issues, in that very exciting and emerging space. So fantastic to be here with you today. Really, the basis of our panel is AI and understanding what AI is. So we see it more and more, it's becoming more prevalent. It seems like there's another use case every minute almost globally in terms of what AI can do and how it can improve, augment, and enhance, the world around us and really our daily lives. We see it from different use cases around, working with COVID and predicting what we might need in terms of PPE, from robots that might supply, protective equipment to people who might need it, particularly in COVID times. There were some really interesting articles about that last year. We see it in terms of improving languages and accessibility globally in terms of translations, completing emails, understanding basic tasks, and just enhancing, cross-industry and cross-sector identification and an improvement just really in every realm. We're also seeing now that there are quite a bit of regulatory developments happening in the space. And the law is really trying to understand the technology and trying to work with the risks that are embedded in that technology. So, in the very wise words of Spider-Man, who said, "With great strength comes great responsibility," that seems to be quite true for AI. But in terms of understanding what that responsibility is, it's crucial to really understand what AI is at a basic level. And so the way that we thought about setting up the discussion today is to really understand what AI is at that basic level, how bias might come about, and then to dive into some of the considerations around what we're seeing in the space in terms of bias mitigation, how different regions are dealing with these considerations around the risks in AI and what we're seeing most recently. And then to talk about some of the guidance that we might see in terms of mitigating these considerations and how organizations are approaching it and what some ideas or best practices might be. We'll also talk about the different realms and the different systems of law and the different bodies of precedent that we might reference in terms of understanding how to navigate this space. Because while the law is evolving, it's certainly not solidified just yet. We really just have different guiding frameworks and different guiding structures that we can use in terms of understanding what we can reference and what the best practices can be. So with that, we'll start with the basics. And Julia, I'll turn it over to you as our data scientist in residence on this panel. Can you talk a little bit about what AI is? Can you describe it at a basic level and just talk about how it works and what it means in practice?
Absolutely. Thanks so much. So yes, my goal, like you said, is to basically demystify AI, talk about what it is and what it isn't. I think it can be very confusing. So when the term artificial intelligence first started being used, it was in the 1950s, basically the start of computing. And as we developed computers, there was a lot of really great algorithms that were developed that actually form the basis today of like current AI systems inspired by biology. There was a famous conference in 1956 in Dartmouth that kind of like is thought of as like the birth of modern AI. However, for a while, like in the basically starting in the 80s to the 90s, it was sort of seen as like a dead field, as like something that never really like lived up to the promise. And it wasn't really until like the 2010s, like 2012 to 2015, with the rendering of images enabled by graphical processing units, that really like took off. So that's when we had these models, most famously and most importantly, the artificial neural networks, that were actually starting to be useful. For the longest time, they actually in my graduate experience, my doctoral advisor used ANN since the 80s, but they weren't really famous. There wasn't a lot of excitement like in my research group. Like some of us used them, but they weren't like anything exciting, because it wasn't really until like later, like starting in like 2015. Most famously, Ang trained like image processing to recognize the image of a cat. So perhaps fueling or perhaps going off of the modern obsession with cats and memes and everything. So basically what you go is from a series of images like pixels, RGB, like each pixel is coded as, has 3 numbers associated for the red, blue, and green light filters. And you take that and you break it into a series of smaller images. And you can think about like what you see in those smaller images. So first you can kind of compress each of those like sort of like small regions into say like average colors. And then once you do that, you start to see the patterns emerge. You start to see the edges. And with the edges, you see like, say like the outline of a cat. And these get more and more sophisticated until we can basically remove the noise. So you can identify images, you can identify faces through fog, through any kind of noise. But that's only enabled because of the enormous like amount of computing power, the millions of images of cats and faces that we have in order to train them. So this kind of like explosion, I would say, of AI has only come about recently. And it's important to note that it's not like robots coming to take over the world when we talk about AI. These are very narrow tasks. So it's amazing that we can train a computer to recognize images in cats, but it's not like general AI. That doesn't really exist as far as I'm aware of, like any kind of like sentience or that sort of intelligence. It's more like narrow tasks. Another example of AI is beating the AlphaGo. Initially, they trained the AI to beat like world champions of Go, which is an extremely complex game. Giving it the rules, so the rules are given, but the steps that is taken there's like basically infinite number of moves. And what was really neat is eventually they didn't need to give the rules even of the game. They could just give some historical games that that had been played by real people. And then the AI would actually learn to generate other games from that. They could infer the rules, and then they can come up with these strategies that no one's ever seen before. So it's amazing, even like masters of these games, chess and Go. And so that technique has really blown everybody away and has been amazing. I'm going to take a step back and talk about what AI is not. So what I do for the most part is data science. So that's kind of like machine learning, decision trees. Basically, you give it a series of rules. It has an algorithm, but it doesn't take millions of images. It's not quite as sophisticated as an AI system. It's very effective, but like most machine learning is not artificial intelligence. Another thing, so again, like if you're giving it the rules and you're giving it the data, it's kind of like you put the data in and you get out the rule, or you get out the result, but that's not really AI. Another example of what AI is not is the Internet of Things. So like collecting data, for example, sensors on a bridge or in your house that would detect problems. That's amazing. It's not AI though, because it's just more like data in and output, like based on like what we train it to do. An example is like Coca-Cola, for example, had a machine for a while where they would have people like get sodas, and they started to look at the patterns of what people are doing because they have the Internet of Things again, like these sensors. And they saw that people would add a cherry flavor to Coca-Cola, or sorry, to Sprite. And so Cherry Sprite was born. So that's an example of using data that's not AI. The Roomba, at least in the earliest iterations, the vacuum cleaner is not AI. Now we're going to start talking about, like, again, like what you put in is what you get out. So this is where you can come up with bias. One of the earliest things I learned as a researcher was garbage in, garbage out. You can't make good, like in my experience, like infectious disease forecasts with really crummy data. It's just not going to work. You can manipulate it in many ways and make it better and make the data sharper, but it's still going to kind of like produce garbage results. So then that's where we come up with bias. We obviously lived in a highly biased world. And so if you give it bias, if you give a model a biased data, then it's going to come up with biased results. And it's going to amplify that even and like be like super biased because of the nature of the pattern recognition. So an example from natural language processing would be where you can use sophisticated neural networks to train to translate languages, like such as Google Translate. So I actually tried this example, and it still works. If you put in "she is a doctor," "he is a nurse" into like a language that has a pronoun that's without a gender, for example, like Turkish, the O, it will come out with "he is a doctor, she is a nurse." So that is still an example of bias that hasn't been detected. So what can we do? So first of all, we can look at the outputs and have a threshold of whether or not they're acceptable. So there's a famous 4/5 hiring rule. And this is even like in the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission outline there, that if you have a minority class, that they should be hired at least 4/5 the rate of the majority class. So an example to explain that is, say that there is an organization that has 25 open positions, and they have a pool of candidates, very large pool, they're very lucky, of 500 men and 1,000 women. And say that they decide to, they first say that 10 of the men and 15 of the women will be hired. Then before they actually hire those people, they can check the 4/5 rule and see that the selection rate for men would be 2%. So 10 divided by 500, and for women, it's only 1.5%. So the way you check to see if you meet the 4/5 rule is you divide 1.5 by 2%, and you get slightly below the cutoff. So you get 75%. So that's like a check for hiring managers. There's also the possibility of debiasing the data. So you can remove inputs that like contain minority class information. That's not necessarily going to be enough. For example, like at VIA, like we make a point not to use demographic data into our data science models in order to have eliminate bias, but that's not necessarily enough because of the strong correlates of census data, like zip code, for example, with race. And so there's more that has to be done. And there's ways of doing this. So for going back to the gender example, if you want to remove the gender bias, you can, using something called a technique called word embeddings, you can actually find the gender, what's called vector, again in the terminology, and you can subtract the gender dimension from others. So you can either do this in like an absolute way to equalize the bias, or you can soften it, because you don't necessarily want to remove definitional words like king or queen that actually are supposed to have gender in them. But that's a way to kind of like debias the results. I think the final thing I'll talk about is just another application of the neural networks again. So I can't show the slides here that I had developed or that are developed that kind of like show the architecture. But another method of doing this is to debias the data itself. So a certain class of neural networks are called generative adversarial networks. And the way you can break this down is the generative part means that like they're actually generating data. So you might have seen this with like deep fakes, where you can actually like generate fake people that like look very much like real people. Like you can't tell them apart from a real person. And the way it does that is you have an adversarial part. So you basically like pit the generated data from the real data, and you train it until you train the model into what's known as Nash equilibrium, when you can't tell the, for example, like getting back to the bias, you can't distinguish an applicant's race or gender. So you would put in the actual data, then you generate fake data, and you transform it through the neural networks into the hidden layers, to the point where you actually can't distinguish the output. And so that's a method that is used in hiring. And I think I will turn it back to the speakers now.
Thank you so much, Julia. And if I can just probe into that a little bit, because I think it's a really well laid out structure of how AI works and kind of the high level overview with some really important details. And so if I'm taking it away in the way that you meant it, it sounds like what really differentiates AI is that predictive quality, right? In terms of taking the data that's being put in and having a predictive way of determining the data that goes out, meaning that otherwise it's not AI, right? It's just use of data, as you talked about with different examples.
Yeah, there is a little bit of a line between what would be called like machine learning, because machine learning is also predictive using the data. What really distinguishes the AI, I guess, is like people typically think of deep learning as artificial intelligence. It's sort of like synonymous at this point. And so that's where you have these deep, again, these neural layers, and they're hidden. If you have one or more layers, and it's known as a deep neural network. And the combinations, the nonlinear transformations that can happen within those layers and do happen, it allows this synthesis to happen and like the generative qualities to happen that don't happen in a typical machine learning algorithm.
Got it. And relatedly, you mentioned that there's the difference between narrow AI and general AI. And I think this is something that's overlooked quite a bit when we think about AI. And it seems like general AI may be confused for what actually is narrow AI, or we think it has broader powers than it actually has. Can you just talk about that a little bit more and say what each one is and what we have right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, like we have amazing AI that can do things that a human can do faster, better. And that's where I think like a lot of the fears come in about the deprofessionalization of myself and lots of other professionals, because AI can detect loopholes in laws faster and better than human lawyers in some experiments anyway. It can beat human game players. It can beat radiologists. And so that's where a lot of like the fears of it come in. And like, we have to be very intentional about thinking about how we want to use the AI as a tool. And then again, like that distinguish between that and general AI, like we have robots are being developed rapidly, like for pets as companions to people. And it's a wonderful thing, but it's important to remember that the robots don't have like sentience. They can mimic a pet. They can kind of like do what a pet might do, based on training, but it doesn't mean that it's autonomous.
Very helpful. And the point that I'm kind of trying to get at here between narrow AI and general AI, and something that I find interesting personally and professionally, is that with narrow AI, it really does exactly what you kind of explained so far, right? It takes data and it executes for a specific purpose. So it uses those predictive elements and those predictive capabilities to produce certain output that's predefined. Versus general AI is more of a, as you described, a sentient, experience where you can intuit a broader purpose and a broader learning and then produce broader outputs. And it sounds like we may be scratching the surface there, but we haven't quite gotten there yet.
Yeah, I don't actually know if we're even scratching the surface. Things are happening very fast. But I think that what's amazing that we've been doing is absolutely the narrow AI and not the general AI at this point. So.
Yeah. And so the question then is, can we, if we are within this realm of narrow AI and we do have control over the data inputs, right? And the data that we're working with in terms of what the AI and ML is working with for that defined purpose, how can we think about the bias mitigation and how can we think about the risks that are embedded in that AI and how we can work around that? So maybe, Elise, I'll turn it over to you in terms of maybe elevating some of what we're seeing across different regions. How are different regions and different governments, maybe different organizations, thinking about this and thinking about some of the bias or some of the risks being presented across AI and narrow AI as we've now pinned down?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's not surprising. We just spent the last, 20 minutes trying to break down this technology and acknowledging at the same time it's growing, it's changing, it's evolving, it's dependent on mass accumulation of data, which is flowing literally across the globe every second. So it is not surprising that regions have started to look at this and have concerns and want to start to regulate in this space. And it comes from a variety of different channels, and it really comes from all corners of the globe. Singapore, for several years now, and their monetary authority have been pushing out guidelines, principles relative to the use of AI by financial institutions. We see a lot out of the financial sector and banking, part and parcel because of the potential for impact to individuals when it comes to sort of financial decisions and financial inclusion, things like that. But it appears in India, it's in Hong Kong, it's in Dubai, Colombia and Brazil and South America. The prior panel referenced, and we're going to get into a little bit, the new proposed EU regulation on AI, but the EU a long time has sort of led the way when it comes to trying to regulate in the data space. We see that elsewhere in privacy law. This is a privacy symposium, and so many of the straight up privacy proposals have some component these days of how AI might be used relative to personal information, how it might not be used, the type of considerations that people want to have. And when we look a little closer to home, historically, the U.S. has not been heavily regulated in this space, and yet they're getting engaged. In the last couple of months alone, the FTC pushed out a blog recently just to remind people that they are very interested in the topic and focused on looking at it and its impact to individuals. The federal banking agencies put out a call for comment for financial institutions on the extent to which their use of AI should be regulated by the agencies and what that might look like. Canada's looking at it. So, I mean, it's truly worldwide. And what I would say is it's not surprising, given, again, how complex this is. It's also not surprising, given the fact that the parties who are often tasked with regulating aren't the deep expert technologists that we have here in Julia on the screen, right? They're not going to have the ins and outs. They're not going to know all of the little nuances between general AI and narrow AI and whether something's AI at all or if it's just a calculator at the end of the day, right? I mean, and this is really a challenging path for all of us to navigate because there is significant impact to businesses, products, services, the way people interact with one another when a regulation comes about. So I think one way that we've chosen to sort of look at this as an opportunity for businesses, because you don't want to be left out necessarily of the conversation or miss the opportunity to take advantage of a lot of these technologies. But with so much unknown, you kind of have to ground yourself in some common principles. And you start to see those emerge, particularly in the privacy space and a lot of the privacy laws and regulations that have a nice way of translating over into the AI space as well. So for the privacy professionals in the audience, it's not going to surprise you that, the fair information privacy principles that have been around for forever and are at the root of a lot of laws are going to be very beneficial and helpful here. Thinking about things from a data minimization perspective, being transparent about how you are using personal information, who you're sharing it with, how it's being processed. Having a sense of data quality, as Julia mentioned, garbage in equals garbage out, and the garbage out could lead to very harmful outcomes for individuals if you're not very careful about the type and kind of information you're taking in and whether it's of good quality or not. So sort of being very mindful of that and making sure that you're constantly checking and rechecking your data streams, your sources, and the third parties you engage with. So again, a recurring theme in a lot of data protection laws and requirements and a lot of financial regulatory requirements, and certainly as a part of the AI conversation is really being strongly aware of the third parties you're engaging with in this space, especially if you're going to be handing over sensitive information, personal information to those third parties to get engaged with them and process them. There's going to be either compelled by law or by contract or some other arrangement, a need to really keep a very close eye on those, to vet them thoroughly before any information is shared or before they connect to your network and potentially pose some security challenges. I think in this space, companies are very eager to get engaged, and not all of them, candidly, are equipped to do so on their own, and that's okay, right? I mean, the way that companies form and contribute to the world doesn't mean that everyone needs to have their own sort of AI team and AI shop building AI products and services in order to take advantage of AI. That's where you start to rely on third parties and partnerships and customers and different parties in the ecosystem who do that very well and bring that to the table. But you also have to be very, very careful and ask the right questions and vet them thoroughly so that at the end of the day, you are working with someone who can be responsible in this space, and perhaps not, a guy in his garage, working out some great new idea that's not quite baked yet, right? So third-party management, I think, will grow and continue in this space as the technology keeps evolving. And again, the data pile keeps getting bigger and bigger. I mentioned security. That's never going to go away, right? At the core of all of this is data, and once you have data, you've got to take care of it. And it's your responsibility as an entity out in the world using this information to make sure that you're doing it the right way. And again, not the least of which, because when these regulations do come, they carry significant penalties for when this data is misused, mishandled, abused in some way. So keeping security always at the top of mind is going to be crucial here. And then lastly, I think a foundation, again, in privacy law, both from a regulatory perspective, in emerging principles, and when it comes to AI, corporate accountability. If you're an entity out there in the world, doing things, thinking about what is ultimately the purpose of this panel is to start to explore there are things that we all will do to comply with the law. Of course, we're going to comply with the law, right? Like, that's the baseline. There are also things that we should be thinking about. What should we be doing? Are there things above and beyond what would be legally mandated by any sort of guidance or principle or regulatory construct that will make this work for the ecosystem overall, and really putting some thought and energy behind it, because it's difficult work to do, right? Tackling things like bias and discrimination and unintended outcomes, and keeping things fair and reasonable, and being as transparent as you can to individuals about when and how you're using these different types of technologies is still going to remain core no matter what happens, right? We're very focused on AI today, and if we get to a place where general AI lives and breathes, such as it is, and grows into the future and people use it, there's going to be something after AI. Right? That we're constantly evolving and getting to a place where there's new technology. So rooting yourself in a lot of these common privacy principles, and really focusing on corporate accountability and responsibility is going to be a way to navigate how all of this changes, I think.
That makes great sense, Elise, and I really like the way you frame that. There's one thing that I want to dive a little bit deeper into what you mentioned. And so you talked about, thinking through the frameworks that are evolving right now and not falling behind, but rather staying ahead. So thinking through how can we, exercise those best practices now? How can we bring them forward? How can we avoid this sort of regulatory debt, right, that might evolve if we don't do those things? And I like that concept because it mimics the concept of technical debt in actual technical builds, right? Where technicians or programmers or engineers might build something and they might cut some corners, but they do it faster. And in the end, they realize that there are some mistakes that are made. So they fall into technical debt. And the question is, how do they correct it? Well, with regulatory debt, it could be that same problem, right? If organizations choose to wait for the law to be codified or for it to be in final effect, or somehow clearly laid out, explained, and interpreted. If we wait until that point to take action or to prepare ourselves, it seems like there's really that risk of falling into that debt at the end of the day. And so
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, that to me, for better or worse, Europe is the region, if you will, that leans very strongly into trying to jump in and regulate, right? And we've seen in other contexts, as goes Europe, so goes the rest of the world. And privacy laws didn't really emerge and become a thing in the United States until after the GDPR was passed. Same thing happened in Brazil, and a lot of Latin American countries are looking to change their practices to mimic more what the GDPR required. We're seeing it elsewhere. There's room and there's deviations, but at the end of the day, this is not a space where you can live and think, well, technically speaking, there's no law that applies to me now, so I can do what I want, if you have hopes to grow or scale beyond where you are exactly now. Because eventually a regulation or some form of law is going to come to you wherever you are and touch on your space. It's just going to. I mean, I think as this progresses, this is not a trend that is going to stop anytime soon. And if that's the case, and if you accept that, and if you have aspirations on doing something bigger or wider or more expansive with this type of data and technology, it is worthwhile to look at things like the EU AI regulation that's being proposed there, data protection standards that have emerged and sort of solidified elsewhere, regulations from the financial sector, the healthcare sector, other places. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about that here for AI. To get ready for that. Again, there are things that from a moral perspective, we have that can we do something, should we do something conversation, but honestly, it's good business sense too to think about, okay, eventually this type of regulation is going to come my way. What can I do now, even at a small level, to start to build in those practices and those things so that when that happens, I'm ready to just keep things moving and I don't have to go back and start from scratch, because once it's baked into the law, you're not going to have the latitude to say, well, I just won't do that, unless you want to shut your business down. And that's not really where anyone wants to end up.
That makes sense. And just one more question on this point, and exactly kind of trailing off of that same thought. If we think about GDPR and the guidance that we had around privacy, right, which was really a big development over the last several years. If we think about where it started, the first draft of the GDPR, I think, was somewhere around 2012. And then the actual implementation, and it came into effect in 2018. So if we think about that, how do we analogize that to where we are now? And how can we think about preparedness and taking the best practice, the best approach to to go forward? Should we think about that and that timing, or is it better to really think through what's in front of us now and take action?
A little bit of both. I would say I believe that right now, when it comes to sort of a final hard and fast regulation in this space, we're more on the early days side of GDPR. There's just too much that's unknown about this. And I think it is very complicated to try to address something like use of AI across multiple sectors in the same exact way. And a lot of these new proposals are trying to do that. That said, you do see, again, those common themes across these things. Are you being transparent about it? Are you being thoughtful about using the information? Are you, architecting not only the models and the systems that ultimately benefit from the models, but the teams who are building the models in a way that sort of tries to mitigate some of these unintended consequences that we've been discussing up until now? It is worth the time and effort to explore those common themes, because I would speculate that any successful resulting regulation is not going to be so granular as to be outdated the minute it's published, right? So it's going to have to rely back a little bit more on some of these core principles as their foundation. And then perhaps for your industry, you may be able to pivot one way or another depending on where things go. But I think it is wise to take this very seriously, if only because there is clearly an appetite around the globe to get on top of this, right? To stop Terminator or whatever is going to happen here, the rise of the Roomba, so to speak. So, making sure that, the way that you're being thoughtful about using personal information in particular and overlaying the technology now is going to pay off in spades down the road, no matter where the regulations go.
That makes very good sense. And I think that is a really nice segue into kind of the next consideration, which is, we have certain frameworks that are emerging, and we have certain governance practices and ideas that different organizations are putting forward and thought leadership in this space. But what else can we draw from? And Erin, maybe I can turn it over to you to talk about some of the other governing frameworks or some bodies of precedent that we can draw from historically or currently that can inform our perspective and some of the work that organizations.
Sure, thanks, Lana. And I think Elise does a great job of explaining some of the more direct attempts to regulate AI that we're seeing now, both the expansion of privacy law that now is including more explicitly how to deal with AI and technology that incorporates aspects of AI, and also the increasing body of law that directly seeks to regulate AI. But one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is, what governance systems do we already have and what bodies of law do we have that are also trying to kind of reach out and extend their principles to look at aspects of AI and how can those be useful to us. And I would generally group those into three categories. Looking at the ESG lens, particularly how we measure environmental and social impact, then the national security regulatory framework, including CFIUS and the body of law that has emerged, around regulating businesses that may have national security implications, and then finally looking at regulating AI through a civil rights lens. So to break those down like one at a time, ESG is something I've been spending a lot of time thinking about recently, especially in its application to transit policy. I work in the transit space, so this is very near and dear to my heart. And thinking about what are the formulas that help determine whether communities get access to federal and state funds for transit. Where are transit deserts located? Where are there communities that are underserved by traditional transit planning and existing modes of transit? And who would greatly benefit from the availability of additional funding for microtransit? How are those decisions being made behind the scenes? And so we've been looking at it through an ESG lens and coming up with our own framework to try to measure the S, or the social impact, and coming up with a way to calculate an accessibility score for a geographic region. So thinking about, how many hospitals, jobs, and schools can a person get to, using existing modes of public transit, and then measuring again how many more hospitals, jobs, and schools can a person get to once VIA or a microtransit system has been brought to their community. And thinking about, adjusting this score for income and for affordability of the service, placing special emphasis around vulnerable populations and serving communities of color, and physical access, whether people with disabilities can access this service, to come up with a holistic score. So thinking about, technologies that incorporate AI in this way can help us measure the impact and also communicate to our stakeholders and implement certain principles of human-centered design. So to think about, who is the end user of this system and how do these AI principles impact that end user, I think we always have to keep that kind of at the front of our minds. And this framework can help us do that and make sure that the services that we design don't have a disparate impact. For example, there have been some recent studies looking at other ride-sharing companies and whether there's a racially disparate impact. If it's harder to get a ride, if there are longer wait times, more frequent cancellations, higher prices for people in communities of color, riders who identify as LGBTQ, and kind of thinking about what that says about algorithmic bias in those systems. That's something that we can kind of look at, in particular through an ESG lens as well. Another body of regulatory work that I think is helpful and interesting, especially as we think about AI, is looking at CFIUS, or the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, and looking at some national security law implications. For example, CFIUS has been very active in looking at the applications of facial recognition technology and how it has been used to surveil protests and dissidents, and particularly most recently, in Black Lives Matter protests, like whether facial recognition technology is being used by law enforcement, to disproportionately target people who are activists, and looking at not only that domestically but also internationally. An example from CFIUS regulation was around when CFIUS became involved with the Grindr transaction and forced a sale of the LGBTQ dating app by its Chinese owner due to concerns that the Chinese government would be in possession of sensitive information about people's sexual orientation or their HIV status, and that could be used somehow to blackmail or harm U.S. citizens or compromise diplomats or political figures or dissidents or people who are critical of government regimes. So thinking about ways that those national security bodies of law could be extended to thinking about how AI has an impact, how the technology could be used, and how it could be misused, in particular in cases that have a national security set of implications. And the last area that I think is super interesting to think about is civil rights law, and in particular when you're thinking about algorithmic bias and AI and all the different ways that can impact people. AI is sort of undergirding this secret framework that maybe people don't realize, but it can make it harder to get a loan, harder to get a job, harder to get a mortgage because you're a member of a protected class. It can determine who goes to prison and who stays in prison because of algorithmic models that predict recidivism, and those are used in sentencing. How resources and teachers are allocated in public schools, what kind of interest rate you might get on your credit card. And all of those things kind of go, to the issue of civil rights. And so, we recently had a really neat diversity training from someone named Angie Bryce at the Bryce Consulting Group, and she really helped us think about, the impact of redlining on society, which was very interesting to think about in the transportation space, and think about, how much of the bias in those maps is now codified into systems of AI, and how does that impact the output of those systems. And so one of the things I think we can take from the civil rights context is to say, we can look at the language of civil rights and the legal precedent to say that scrutiny shouldn't be focused on disparate intent. What did the designers of the model intend? But more on disparate impact. So, Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, many of us are familiar with, provides that using a facially neutral employment practice that has an unjustified adverse impact on members of a protected class is not permissible. And it describes, a facially neutral employment practice is one that doesn't appear to be discriminatory on its face, but rather one that is discriminatory in its application or its effect. And I think that language can be very parallel in the AI context. We have to not only think about what was the intent, but also what is the effect, regardless of whether or not that is tied to the intent or not. How is it impacting the end users and the stakeholders? And to kind of think about, it doesn't matter if algorithmic programmers intended disparate treatment, or if the formula runs without human intervention and it appears to be facially neutral if you look at the algorithm, but instead we should be asking ourselves the question of whether it results in a disparate impact on a group of persons or on a protected class, and then making decisions accordingly.
That makes very good sense, and it's a really nice way to think about the body of law that we have, right? Everything that we've already developed, what we as people, what the courts have thought through, where jurisprudence has taken us so far. And it's not so different from what we're seeing evolve in the AI regulatory space, because essentially it's rooted in ethics. And ethics kind of, they elevate these principles that we now have codified in certain laws in Title VII, like you mentioned. But at the very base of it, it's an ethical framing of how we think our society should work and how we all do a better job living day to day and treat each other more fairly. And so with that in mind, I think that's actually a nice segue to talk about what we are seeing in the most recent EU regs and what some of the focus is there and how those principles are being elevated. So Elise, maybe I can turn it over to you for a high level framing of just some of what we're seeing in the new regulation.
Yes, yeah, happy to do a very quick overview. It's well over 100 pages. They're master regulators out there over in Europe, so I tip my hat. But this is one that people are very, very closely watching. It is highly likely to be influential again globally, and it's bold. It is attempting to address use of AI across all sectors. It has extraterritorial reach. It is really trying to think about how to encapsulate all of the different types of activities we've been talking about. So it discusses things about AI systems, which is defined very broadly. It's going to sweep in even things like software developed with the use of AI, right? So if you start thinking about it that way, that can start to bring to the table a lot more than perhaps people are thinking about on its surface. And what it's trying to do is it's aiming for this risk-based approach, right? And thinking about different types and kinds of uses of AI, where there is the potential for, I like Erin's phrasing, minimal risk of harmful impact to an individual, where perhaps that can be a little bit more lightly regulated, going up the spectrum to really what they're calling out and out unacceptable uses of AI. And those are the things that could cause physical or psychological harm, use by public authorities to evaluate the trustworthiness of an individual, different things like that, right? So it's a bold move on there. The regulatories for these higher risk activities are going to really dig deep into sort of regulatory oversight of system development, management of the information, the training and testing behind the scenes, different things like that. Again, security and transparency, accountability. We see those themes. They start in privacy, they get ported over here again. As core to how this all could potentially work. And again, we want to pay attention to it because not the least of which that's got some significant penalties up to and including 6% of global turnover for failure to meet the requirements. It's in its early proposed stage, as Alona referenced, these things take time, but they have a lot of intent. It got a lot of attention globally. It prompted, again, a lot of activity, even over here in the US. People are sitting up and taking notice. And so this is going to be one to watch as it evolves.
Certainly. And it's interesting to think too about some of the principles that are coming out of the regulations, but also other frameworks that are emerging based on other bodies of law and just based on how organizations are thinking about best practices and how to approach this space more broadly. And so what are some of the things that we're seeing in this space? What are some of the things that we're seeing being developed? And this is a question for the entire panel, just in terms of, how organizations are approaching this, or maybe how we're thinking through, what we can do as next steps. And I think one important consideration is kind of the outside perspective, the formation of governance boards that we're seeing, cross-disciplinary panels of advisors, right, of governing perspectives and diverse ideas, not just from a more traditional diversity lens, but from a diversity of thought perspective, like the prior panel was talking about, which I thought was really relevant and interesting in terms of getting cross-disciplinary, risk-minded professionals in the room to share their perspectives and advise on strategy, on builds, on how to make sure that we're thinking through all of the dimensional considerations around AI builds. But that's just one example. And so I open up to you, to the rest of the panel, just to share any perspectives on what we're seeing emerge in this space and what are some of the takeaways in terms of how to take this forward.
Yeah, maybe I can get started and reinforce or sort of echo what you've been saying too, because getting that diversity of perspective can happen in very big and very small ways, right? So you can actually begin, even if you feel like perhaps you're a smaller player, you're just getting started with AI, you're just emerging in this space. You don't necessarily have to jump to external advisory boards, but start really, really, really basically with, there's a team of people working on an AI solution or a model and developing it. Are they working in total isolation, or are they working with feedback from business partners in the company, compliance professionals in the company, privacy professionals in the company? I have to reference that, obviously, but the legal team, the security team, are your customers. How are, trying to look at it from multiple lenses already as a foundation really works for any sort of product development process, but it is crucial here because you want to make sure you're doing everything you can to account for sort of all of the necessary perspectives to try and, again, avoid unintended consequences. One other thing I would reference also is do it again and again and again, right? Just because you had that moment in time with all of those people, the model will evolve, inputs will come in, they need to be looked at, the results need to be looked at and recalibrated, and then you got to go back to those people and talk about it again. This is not a process that has a natural endpoint if you're truly using this technology effectively.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that you make, Elise, and thinking about advisory boards and cross-functional teams. And in my view, I think that the field of AI really needs sort of cross-functional thinkers, people who do more than just sort of examine the task at hand and complete that task, but think sort of broadly and deeply about how this technology affects end users and society as a whole. So I think one thing that our viewers can do is just kind of educate themselves along multiple axes. Encourage them to think about the implications of AI for society and technology and for the work that they do. And so I have some recommendations of some things I've watched and read recently that I found super interesting. Maybe you all would too. I definitely recommend the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. I don't know if you guys have seen that, but it will make you throw out your kids' iPhones and iPads right away because the level of AI that kind of is behind all of our social networks is something that people who use those networks should certainly understand and give thought to, and it kind of demystifies a little bit of the AI that is embedded into social networking. I'm reading a novel now called Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro, which about AI specifically and the use of artificial friends, artificial intelligence, and how closely it can approximate sentient beings. So sort of like what Julia was talking about with the development of AI pets and whether they are sentient or not, and what role they can play in people's lives and sort of mimicking and perceiving emotions. Super interesting field of thought. And then lastly, I would give a hat tip to my friend Dwana Franklin Davis, who's the CEO of Reboot Representation, talking about getting more women and minorities involved in tech and working in tech. And she recommended to me a book called Weapons of Math Destruction by Cathy O'Neill, which has a lot of great quotes in it. But one of the quotes that really stood out to me was, the privileged are processed more by people, the masses more by machines. And I think that's super interesting when you think about it. The lower down in the income spectrum you go, and the more you have marginalized communities, the more that they don't necessarily receive the benefit of individualized human consideration for many of the decisions that we referenced earlier. And the more those decisions are made for them algorithmically, behind the scenes by AI, and that, if we know that, then we can think more broadly about what does that mean for society and how can we take this into account when we're trying to correct algorithmic bias in our AI systems. So we can think about, the economic, the social, the racial implications of bias in our AI, and not just assume these models are facially neutral, but recognize that they all inherently replicate the bias of their programmers, like Julia mentioned, garbage in, garbage out, but then also that AI enables them to scale these errors and become super biased. And that this knowledge helps us recognize the transformative potential, but also it magnifies the challenges we face as these technologies become increasingly integral to our digital first lives when we're all on Zoom all the time. So, I think that's why it's incumbent on us, for people who work at technology companies, to think about the legal and ethical dimensions of these products, including while they're under development. To have these cross-functional teams and have these advisory boards and to ask these questions, so we can avoid creating feedback loops by only talking to our colleagues and only talking to our teams, but asking these questions in broader forums like this one, and crafting algorithmic impact statements, for example, thinking about how the technology impacts the environment, how the technology impacts end users. And then finally, just by diversifying hiring, as the last panel mentioned and focused on extensively, I think that's yet another reason why it's super important to have diverse teams and diverse employees at tech companies who represent the user base of all of our products, so we can reduce the inherent bias of a homogeneous group of programmers just looking at data sets and making assumptions that then get replicated.
I agree with all about it, and I think that's really well said and very, very interesting. And one thing that I wanted to focus on a little bit more is the explainability element, right? So really understanding the work that AI is doing. And I think that's one of the best practices that's emerging for me, is not just having a black box, but really working to understand that AI and not falling into something called intellectual debt, which I read in a New Yorker article and I thought was really interesting, which is the concept of, if we take something as a given, right? If an AI model or something that's AI based gives us output that we then take as a given, but we don't quite understand how we arrived there, we fall into a sort of knowledge gap where we're not sure how we got there in the end. And I think, Erin, that ties in with some of what you mentioned in terms of discriminatory practices in marginalized communities, in terms of not getting the benefit of that human attention. And Julia, you mentioned earlier the element of human oversight, to make sure that we're paying attention to AI and thinking through how it's doing what it's doing, but also, to the best practices point, documenting what it's doing. And I think the technical documentation around how AI is being built will become quite important as we go forward. And whether or not it's prescriptive in different frameworks or regulatory guidance, I think that element of really describing how AI works will become increasingly important as we go forward. Collaboration too, I think this is something that we talked a bit about in our pre-panel discussions, in terms of intra-organizational collaboration and really having a forum to talk about things that anyone is spotting around AI, and making sure that it can be addressed in an open discussion, that there's not any stigma attached to anyone, raising considerations. So the effort really being to avoid kind of that whistleblower scenario, but instead encourage a collaborative space where we can build something that's better at the end of the day, and creating that open forum. Excellent. I'm mindful that we're coming up to the end of our time. If you could give, kind of one piece of thought, feedback, or advice on what we're all seeing out there in terms of where we go forward, how would you capsule it in terms of the next stage? What would be, your one kind of takeaway and perspective? And I can start with myself, just to kind of kick it off, and maybe we'll take it home from there. My thinking is, if we want to see a better tomorrow, we should focus on ethical AI by design. And ethics is a loaded term, but it's also something that we can actively think about. And I think everything we talked about in this panel shows that intentionality is really crucial. So having that intentionality when it comes to data, and understanding what kind of data is going in and then coming out, and how we're designing it and how we're documenting that design, all of that combined seems to really set us up for a recipe for success in terms of ethical AI and related considerations.
I would echo that, say, using individuals, right? At the end of the day, the easiest thing to relate to is, how would you feel about use of your information in this way, right? And if you keep that kind of mantra in mind, and then extrapolate and say, how would your customers feel, individuals out in the world feel about use of information in this way, and center around being really responsible and accountable to that individual, and respecting their personal information and how it's ingested and processed and handled throughout this process, I think that's the best foundation you can start from. Not the least of which because it makes it a little bit more personal to you. You kind of start to think very quickly about, oh, I might not like it if my information were used this way or that way, and I would want more clarity around these points or that point, or I would want somebody to be double checking systems in a way that took care of my information the right way. So I would say center yourself on the individual and build from there.
Well said.
I can pick up on that for what Elise said. I totally agree that when we're designing new technologies, we have to keep it human-centered and keep the empathy in perspective. But I don't think that that's enough. I think, like Erin said, we also need to look at the outcomes and not just the intentions of the developers, because like often very well-intentioned people develop technologies that are used just to like maximize profit, and they could have a lot of negative impacts on the world. So I think that we need to look at like robustness, like as a technology person, as a data scientist, like from my perspective, I think that we need to look at the impact on the outliers. So not just like the things that we expect to happen, but simulate the whole range of like possibilities of what's going to happen, and really focus on those like worst case scenarios, identify the failure thresholds, and try to redesign the system to avoid those. I think that's really important.
Fantastic. So I think we're probably out of time, and this has been a fantastic panel. Yeah. Really appreciate everyone's participation today. And Rajesh, with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much to all the esteemed panel speakers. It has been a wonderful session. Thanks, Noam, Erin, Elise, Julia, and Julia. Thanks for pitching up in the last minute, and most of the conversations, even though on touching on technical aspects, were much right on to the point. It's a bullseye. Some of the key points that I would like to just recap as part of the session. Garbage in and garbage out. I hope the essence of that particular thing is clearly understood by most of the developers and programmers and organizations who are trying to maximize more use of the data and trying to yield and results. So that's exceptional. One of the other point came in as the need for the organization to mimic the concept with developers and programmers and think through the design with laid out requirements of the law. I think this is the point where I would like to bring in where Trevor, the CEO and president of IAPP, was just saying that the lawyers needs to learn to be geeks and geeks need to be learning to be the lawyers. I think that's exceptionally more in order for you to understand the impacts of privacy. And one of the best part is I really like the last point was more about a forum to discuss and encourage a cooperative space. I think this is very crucial and essential if it has to be something for a wider group of benefiting the most of the public. So, and as rightly called by ethics is a loaded term, but it is essential for a successful encouragement of ethical AIs. And respecting users' privacy and needs, where you need to center yourself on the individual. Thanks, Erin. That's a good takeaway for all the audience who are listening in. And Julia, Elise, it's more about the human-centric and empathic should be considered. I think the impact on the outliners and focus on failure thresholds. I think this is a good insight. Thank you very much, and thanks for being here for wonderful insights. Thanks again on behalf of Infosys Data Privacy Office and IAPP. So going on to the next session, this session is more about synthetic data. So information is available for processing when regulations and other privacy concerns restrict access to the original data. So what is, in order to prevent itself from any compliance or governance issues, organizations start trying to use more data in a more of a synthetic form. So among privacy enhancing technologies, using of synthetic data as one of an anonymization techniques provides the organizations more agility and freedom to process the data in a safe and compliant way. but it also has its own cons. I mean, the cons is about how to balance between to meet the utility of the data and the level of privacy that needs to be placed in. So this means that the synthetic data should provide, from an analytical point of view, the closest value to the real world data. And good synthetic data promises to be nearly indistinguishable form while still preserving privacy. However, there's a huge amount of privacy information leakage that do definitely happen. So on this particular topic, I'd like to call upon next speaker, Patricia Thain, who is the co-founder and CEO of Private AI, a Toronto and Berlin-based startup, which is into creating a suite of privacy tools that makes it easy to comply with data protection regulations, mitigate cybersecurity threats, and maintains customer trust. She's a computer science PhD candidate at the University of Toronto and a postgraduate affiliate at the Vector Institute doing research on privacy preserving natural language processing with a focus on applied cryptography. Her research interest also includes computational methods for loss, language decipherment. Patricia is a recipient of the NCRC Postgraduate Scholarship, the RBC Graduate Fellowship, the Beatrice Trixie Olsley Graduate Scholarship in Computer Science, and the Ontario Graduate Scholarship. She has 9 years of research and software development experience, including at the McGill Language Development Lab, the University of Toronto's Computational Linguistic Lab, the University of Toronto's Department of Linguistics, and the Public Health Agency of Canada. She is also a member of the Board of Directors of Equity Showcase, one of the Canada's oldest not-for-profit charitable organization. Impressive bio. So I would like to call upon Patricia Thain. The session is all yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for that kind intro, Rajesh. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invite. So I'm really excited to give this talk. I would love for it to be as interactive as possible, even though we're online. So if you have any questions, please feel free to pop them up as soon as they come up. I'd like to make sure that everything's clear throughout the conversation. I'll start with going over the different kinds of data that we can deal with. So there's structured data. Right? So what you normally think of in a database with structured columns saying these are the names, these are the social security numbers, things like that. And for structured data, that's generally what you're trying to do when you're creating synthetic replicas of the data is maintain the statistical patterns of the data while preserving the privacy of the individuals within the data set. For semi-structured data, it can be similar, but then you're also dealing with, for example, notes within a column of the database, and then you have to deal with it with a mix of the structured synthetic data tactics as well as the unstructured synthetic data tactics. And when we say unstructured data, it's things like audio, text, video, and there, the purpose of synthetic data tends to be a little bit different. It's not so much for keeping the underlying statistical patterns of the data as much as oftentimes, for example, if you're creating synthetic faces, to blur out or to create data that's similar enough to the real data so your machine learning models downstream don't get affected when you're using that information for training them. So one example would be if you're counting the number of people in the street, you don't need to see their faces, but it would be nice if their faces are obfuscated in a realistic way. In terms of privacy concerns, what we're dealing with are things like identity disclosure. So what you're worried about with identity disclosure is, can you figure out the identity of a person within the data set? And when you do, what other things can you find out about them? So can you figure out what the particular row in a data set belongs to? And oftentimes that goes hand in hand with attribute disclosure. Attribute disclosure is what can you figure out about an individual within a data set, But attribute disclosure and identity disclosure really have to go hand in hand, because a lot of the times, if you figure out the identity of somebody but don't have any particular attributes associated to that person, might not be a big deal. If you just have my name, you have my identity, but what else do you know about me? In terms of attribute disclosure, you might find out somebody's age, but you might not know who that age belongs to. So you really need to keep both hand in hand when you're thinking about what the privacy concerns are when you're creating synthetic data, and determining whether the risk is of attribute disclosure or of identity disclosure, or how they relate to one another. So a lot of the times, what can happen is you can calculate the risk of identity disclosure given a set of attributes that you know. That is generally the better way of approaching re-identification risk after you create a synthetic data set. Then there's group attribute disclosure. Group attribute disclosure is the concern that given a synthetic data set, you can figure out something that's sensitive about a group of individuals, whether or not they were in the original training set. And in terms of membership disclosure, that's really about figuring out whether a particular individual was part of the training set, so part of a particular study, for example. And that can come with a number of problems, one of which we'll discuss. Any questions so far? Okay. So there was this South Korean chatbot that was a love bot where different partners communicate their intimate conversations in this chatbot. And this chatbot company was training on their users' data conversations. It started spewing out personal information like names, nicknames, home addresses, and so on. So if you think about the particular personal information that can be memorized, what really happens is the problem is when you have either a membership disclosure problem, so a problem where you know that this person was part of the data set, and this is a love bot. You might not want to be caught using a love bot, for example. And another problem is when models memorize entire streams of data. So, hey, my name is, and then my home address is, that kind of thing, because you're linking attributes to names of individuals. That gives you more information about that particular person. So what we're dealing with are direct identifiers. So names, full names, social security numbers can be direct identifiers, credit card numbers, things like that. Then quasi-identifiers like age, like approximate location, like height, any physical attributes, things that when combined together leads to an exponential risk of re-identifying an individual. And one thing I want to get across is that even direct identifiers on their own can sometimes be harmless. So if you find somebody's social security number on the street but don't know who it's associated with, and have no other way of finding any other information about them, what are you going to do with that social security number? Same thing with a credit card number. If you don't have the CVV, if you don't have the expiration date, the person's name, what are you really going to do with that credit card number? So it becomes, it's the linkage of the data that's really the problematic aspect of it. Any comments or questions? Okay. So really the problem that we're seeing with this Korean love bot is the membership disclosure through the identity disclosure. From the memorization of names, of usernames, of exact locations, things like that. And this is something that the amount of data that they had from their customers is something that ScatterLab actually boasted about quite a bit. And it wasn't until they discovered that these leaks were happening through these conversations that the chatbot was spewing out that it became a problem. So it's something that I suspect happens quite a bit, but doesn't get as much news coverage as Scatter Labs problem did. So if you have any other examples of these, would love to hear them in the chat if you'd like to discuss those. Okay, but what happens when it goes well? So we've all heard of GPT-3. GPT-3 has been used in a number of applications. In the one that I'm showing here, it's a chatbot that this person, Nikita, created that is about talking through different creative ideas, right? So talking about how to motivate himself, the chatbot is giving him ideas of how to motivate himself and how to create time for the projects he's working on. Pretty cool, right? The one thing about GPT-3, GPT-2, and these large machine learning models is that they aren't trained using privacy-preserving techniques. So if they were using differential privacy, it does take a much longer time to train, and these already cost quite a bit of money to train, given the amount of data that they go through. There is a paper by Carlini et al. That discusses how GPT-2 can spew out entire threads of information from the training data. So having sensitive information like names and addresses all together from public data sources. But then the question becomes, what happens with the data that you're sending to the servers when you're using this third-party API? Are they then using differentially private gradient descent for the training of the model, which allows you to add noise? It actually allows the model to memorize less when it sees rare events. So so if it just sees something once, or in the case of this paper by Carlini et al., they showed that GPT-2 memorized entire sequences of sensitive information that only appear 10 times within one document, for example. And differentially private gradient descent helps prevent that. However, we can see that there are quite a few benefits from having these models available, right? So we don't want to just discard them. They can help us generate a bunch of training data. They can be privacy preserving if they are trained properly. They're really great for creating realistic content for certain tasks as well. And the limitations are something that we can figure out a way around. Any questions so far? Okay, great. What considerations should we take when it's not easy to de-identify data to be used for research, for example, for a large XML data set where there is no consistency around where the PHI resides? Okay. Okay. Let me think about that. What considerations should we take when it's not easy to de-identify data to be used for research? For example, large XML data sets where there's no consistency around. So the first thing is figuring out what kind of data you're dealing with. I'm going to deal with this question later because it's not really relevant to the current discussion. But thank you for your question, Pramod. I'll talk about it right after. Okay, so where was I going? Oh, yes. Okay, so the right solution okay, so another limitation about having models that just create entirely synthetic data sets is that you can't use these models to then infer about particular texts. For example, if you're having a specific conversation and you want to preserve the privacy of that specific conversation, but still infer the sentiment, still infer how well the conversation went, what kind of things were talked about. This isn't something that you can use for that purpose. So it is the difference between creating synthetic data using machine learning versus using machine learning to create synthetic data, to train synthetic data generation. Okay, so what can we do about this limitation? What we can do is targeted synthetic data generation, so automatic pseudonymization. So here's an example of something that we've run through the private AI system. So, hey Fanny, love seeing you on Friday. Will you call me sometime next week? Maybe around March 15th. I want to watch Avengers with you, but I'm worried my arthritis will act up, so please be flexible. I've called your dad. He's having a best time in Eritrea, and so on. So what we can do with AI is create very targeted synthetic data. So, hey, Lizzie, love seeing you on Friday. Date is changed to June 30th, and arthritis is changed to allergies, having the best time in New York. So you could still tell approximately what the conversation is about. You just don't have any specific person identifiable information from the individuals. And the really cool thing about this is that you can then use this data to train machine learning models without worrying about this data being spewed out because there's no link to the particular individuals within the conversation. Would recommend any questions at the last. Okay. All right. So this is also a part where if we discuss disclosure risk versus data utility, which is often a very debated question, it's more tricky depending on the task that you're dealing with, but it tends to be more tricky with structured data. So that's really where you have to balance the disclosure risk versus data utility very carefully. You do have to think about disclosure risk quite a bit when you're dealing with unstructured data, but the tasks that you could do with targeted synthetic data that's generated are quite numerous, and it doesn't affect the accuracy of the downstream models. So when we've been doing research about this at Private AI to see what the downstream model accuracy loss is when you do this target synthetic data generation with sentiment analysis, named entity recognition, and a number of other tasks, and the downstream model accuracy is not affected, which is really cool because that means that in addition to being able to reduce or remove the accuracy loss, we can also reduce the re-identification risk by creating this very natural synthetic data. And the reason is that if anything is missed as person identifiable information, it's very difficult to tell what is person identifiable information that is real versus the fake generated information. And there's really interesting research being done at the University of Toronto by Mohammed Abdallah about this topic. In terms of re-identification risk, so the field is in fairly early stages for dealing with this for unstructured data. There's quite a bit of research in how to deal with this for structured data. Professor Khaled Al-Imam is a person who works on this quite a bit, and he's going to be speaking in the next session, I believe. So there's there are a few papers I'd recommend for how to think about this in terms of unstructured data. There's Sakano et al.'s a unified framework for evaluating the risk of re-identification of text de-identification tools. And the reason that I'm talking about re-identification risk for de-identification rather than for synthetic data is because these very tools can be used for determining afterwards what the risk of identity disclosure is given the synthetic data. In this unified framework for evaluating the risk of re-identification of text de-identification tools, it's pointed out that a lot of the times that when people are analyzing what the de-identification tools can do and how well they work, it's usually the precision we call an F1 score of these tools when it comes to predicting the different direct identifiers and quasi-identifiers, rather than analyzing it as a function of how much PII gets through in the first place, and then how much unique PII gets through. So the thing is that if you are dealing with a medical data set, for example, and a patient name gets through, it's game over for that patient, right? So it's not about how many times you catch that patient's name, it's about whether you catch all of the instances of that patient's name. So there are some interesting points in that paper, and in our paper called Reasoning about Unstructured Data De-Identification, we talk about what other aspects you need to worry about when you're dealing with risk re-identification risk scoring within text. So things like authorship recognition, recognizing what the social components of an author are, or for example, what their location is, what their language of, what their mother tongue is, and so on, based on the text that they're writing. So what other aspects, aside from what's within the text, that you can pull out with artificial intelligence. Okay. Let's see. Okay. And yeah, so I really like this other paper that I'd recommend you take a look by Ella et al. On evaluating identity disclosure risk in fully synthetic data, health data, and model development validation. So this is specifically for structured data, if that's what you're dealing with. And the idea there is that it's not for generating synthetic data generation, one thing that's lacking is the re-identification risk scoring when it comes to the very end, once the data is produced. And El-Imam et al. Here propose a method for doing the re-identification risk scoring of the generated synthetic data in synthetic structured data after it's produced. And that's using fairly traditional re-identification risk scores that are very robust and calculated based on, for example, statistics of a population. Okay. So one thing I'd like to say is to keep in mind that creating this mirage of data through synthetic data generation is one way of many to address privacy concerns, and that there are different privacy enhancing technologies out there. It's not a one versus the other. It's really a combination of them that are useful for different use cases. So we do have a privacy enhancing technologies decision tree on our blog that you can take a look at. And yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Okay. Nice, lots of questions. Okay, let me get back to Pramod's first question. What considerations we take when it's not easy to de-identify data to be used for research? For example, a large XML data set where there are no consistency around where the PHI resides. So first thing is to determine what kinds of sensitive information you find within that XML data set, what you need to remove or obfuscate in order to reach the results that, or to make the inferences that you need to make, or train the model that you need to train. Yeah, and you might have to, if you are creating a synthetic XML data set, as a result, you might have to bite the bullet and make your where the PHI resides more consistent within that data set. But it really depends on the task that you need to run that for. Can you talk about model inversion attacks, which can expose personal data disclosure even when synthetic data is used? Yeah. So, okay. So I'm mainly thinking of it in terms of unstructured data. That's where my main specialization lies. I haven't heard of any of those within unstructured data. If synthetic data is used, but that's not that it can't. That doesn't mean it can't happen. So what you can think of is if you use GPT-2, for example, to spew out information spew out training data for your model. That's synthetic data, but they're also memorizing large chunks of personally identifiable information that are present on the internet. So you can, if you're just using that as training data, have the same model that you're training respew that information as well. Okay, just gonna stop screen sharing. Okay, I think I'm being told that the presentation is over. Is that correct, Rajesh? Okay, great, thank you. Okay, question 3. With real-life data, which can be incredibly complex and varied, what are good frameworks available? How is the quality of such data which is generated can be determined? So that's also very task dependent, whether the quality of the data, how well the quality of the data can be determined. So it's a very tough question to answer without a particular task in mind. So if we're thinking about the synthetic data that's generated for creating a sentiment analysis model, for example, for conversational data, how good the quality of the data is determined on how well your model works in the real world. And the framework that you'd use to see how private the data that you're training it on is analyzing the re-identification risk of the data. So happy to talk more about that re-identification risk framework with anybody who messages me afterwards. It's just quite a bit to cover in 25 minutes, so didn't want to get into the nitty-gritty of the math, but really happy to if anybody wants to. In an organization with global presence, how can data sharing between internal group companies be facilitated through privacy-preserving synthetic data? Will this help organizations in decision making? Yes. Okay. So what we've seen a lot of the time is companies within organizations, one group can often not be sent data from another group. They are siloed. So one example is customer service data being sent to machine learning teams. And by creating synthetic data for these machine learning teams to deal with, then that means that they can provide better products for the customer service teams. So it does break down silos in that way. Okay. I think that's it for the questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Patricia. I mean, it's really insightful. I just wanted to, I just tried to jump in before, closing the session, specifically on the last query that came through. There are organizations which have multi-jurisdictional presence, and they're probably the centerfold in which some of the business decisions are taken doesn't belong to be either within say US or Europe. It's spread across and it's somewhere in a third country. And now In such cases, for decision-making purposes, this could involve, performance ratings that can impact board employees or certain decisions in terms of how organization or financial conditions. So there are a lot of informations, and one of the most important thing is usage of Excel, which is in a more of an unstructured format, is the widely used documentation. So so the biggest challenge is in cases of DSR, how that logging trails to be raised. And to avoid the DSR, I think one of the requirements even under the GDPR is Article 11, which talks if the data is pseudonymized, you don't get the risk that such a DSR requirement doesn't apply to such kind of data. Now, with all these things, I think using of can organizations be able to use these kind of privacy preserving synthetic data in these kind of cases where certain reports that are generated will be able to meet the business decision making purpose? Or I think this is one of the important questions that I'm 100% sure lot of organization would like to see an answer. This can avoid not only the DSR, it's also more about meeting the data deletion requirement. Complying with the data deletion of unstructured format is a huge risk, and I'm sure most of the organization at the board level has gone with an accommodation that, as an industry practice, it is something that you need to accept and live with it. So, do you see such kind of work, such kind of projects and research based on your experience, and something which, if you ponder upon, if you see that something that can apply, which organizations can consider viewing and seeing as part of some kind of an implementation that they can take it as internal? Any insights about that if you can just share? I think this will really help for a lot of audiences who are looking at this to and specifically for the data privacy officers, legal counsels who are actually managing to meet compliance. This will be an one of the most key takeaway in this entire event. So something that you can ponder upon.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I've seen a lot of, what privacy lawyers are looking at, what it seems the GDPR is going for, what I hear a lot from DPOs is it really comes down to the re-identification risk. So getting that re-identification risk scoring right is really necessary after you've created the synthetic data. And with it's never going to be a 100% zero risk with either security or privacy. It's about minimizing that as much as possible. And it's about also showing the courts that you've worked really hard to minimize the risk as much as possible. One thing I want to point out about the GDPR is it claims that pseudonymization is not as secure as anonymization. And the reason that they claim that is because the definition of pseudonymization under the GDPR is that there needs to be a linkage between the pseudonymized information with the original data. That linkage does not have to exist. And if you have unlinked pseudonymized data, it's actually more secure than if it's not pseudonymized and just replaced with, for example, the tokens that that the data was. The kind of token the data had.
Great. I think this is one big Pandora box that needs kind of a more delved. I'll be happy to look into this, but this is something which can, a lot of organizations. I've been with a lot of panels. I've been talking to a lot of colleagues, who are part of peers in different organizations. I think this is one thing which really bothers. You need the day-to-day operations to continue to run, but at the same time, the data cannot move because of certain critical compliance-related issues. It's just not because it may really, the amount of time that you may end up wasting when a particular employee raises a DSR and starts pondering and asking, I need this, I need all these reports. It really bothers, brings down the entire operations into a standstill to focus and agree on to this situation. And I hope these kind of mechanisms, even though I do understand this is one of the anonymization techniques, but I'm more interested. I'm looking forward to Paul's session tomorrow, which is mostly on the anonymization, zero anonymization topic, which will also be more interesting as such. And anyway, I'm really thankful for you being here, and it was a great session and valuable insights. And that's something which, and I would like to also see if we can have those PPTs, which probably we can make it available so for users to access once the recorded versions of the sessions is displayed both internally or to the external speakers who have registered, participants who have registered for this event.
Right.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much for having me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So the next in the line of topic is more in terms of one of the most interesting topic. We have been, as we are trying to go through the sessions, we started the session with AI versus human behavior, and what are the goods and what are the myths around it. Then we ventured into some of the concepts with the great panel discussions with esteemed panel speakers on the ethical AI by design, where you embed ethical issues aligned as part of your design process. So it was slowly getting into much of the operational aspects, and that was widely discussed and used, and it was deliberated among the panel set of speakers. Now, one of the privacy enhancing technology is using of the synthetic data as kind of an anonymization technique, and Patricia was great in explaining some of the basics, some of the require, and what are the benefits around in order for you to balance between the utility as well as the level of privacy, and make sure that the data has certain value at the end of the day for which it is being operationalized. Now, the final session of this topic is more about the legal challenges. I mean, everything that we try to enforce is circular. It just revolves around the regulations and making sure that the organization ensures compliance and accountability. Now, with this, the final session, the topic is about AI, legal and ethical challenges. I would, for this, it would be a great privilege to call upon our next speaker, Inderpreet Shane. Inderpreet Shane is our Group General Counsel and the Chief Compliance Officer of Infosys. In her role, she leads the legal and compliance function of the company. She's a strategic business partner supporting the business in legal and regulatory matters and ensuring the implementation of the compliance and ethics program of the company in line with Infosys core C-Life values. She's a seasoned international professional with over 25 plus years of experience, including as a general counsel of a large IT service company and as a managing partner of a mid-sized law firm in the Silicon Valley, where her mandate included counsel on complex international transactions. She also serves on the National Advisory Council of Savannah, the South Asian Bar Association of North America. She's also a frequent speaker at the international conferences. And also, as I know, she's also the brand ambassador of ACC, the Association Corporation of Counsel. Inderpreet has a BA Hons and LLB degree from the Delhi University and an LLM from Queen's University, Kingston, Canada. Inderpreet also serves as a director on the boards of Edgeworth Systems Limited and Infosys BPM Limited. Over to you, Inderpreet. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rajesh. First of all, for this opportunity. I'm very delighted to speak to this audience. I also caught some part of the previous session that, that the debate that was going on, and obviously seems like you've had an interesting couple of days debating topics that are not only very topical, but also from my perspective, the intersection of data privacy with law is completely, I would not even say it's intersects, but it's intertwined. And I certainly value the partnership that I have with the data privacy team at Infosys. We partner together, the legal and the data privacy team, on many, many issues. So thank you for giving me this opportunity. And I hope that in these times, as everybody is dealing with some unprecedented challenges on account of COVID, that everybody is staying safe. So the topic that I'm going to speak to today is artificial intelligence and ethical and legal challenges. The good news is I don't have a PPT, so we'll walk through some of these issues. I also hope that as a part of this session that I'll leave you with some questions because a lot of this is happening as we are living and breathing this change that is taking place amongst us. And there are far more questions than there are answers that we're all looking to find solutions to, finding the right balance between technology that is hurtling at us, as well as you know, the issues around liability, legal issues, and the ethical issues and the dilemmas that face the data privacy community, the technology community. So let me first start by posing I guess, a rhetorical question, because I can't look at the audience. But you know, when I was preparing for this session, the thing that surprised me was, when was the first conference on artificial intelligence held? And you know, if people were to seek that answer, yes, Rajesh, you want to take a guess? Sorry, I thought I heard it. Yes, thank you. I was surprised to learn that it was in 1956. So artificial intelligence has been around for more than a decade, and a lot longer than many of you have lived and walked on this planet. But something has obviously changed, as this has now become front and center of many issues that we are tackling. You know, AI has gained prominence like never before, and as we sit, you know, at the beginning of the fourth industrial revolution, we see some major technological trends that are coming towards us, which has, of course, artificial intelligence at its center, accompanied by cloud computing, Internet of Things, blockchain, and everything is really moving at an unprecedented pace as technology is getting embedded in everything, you know, that in every facet of our life. And if anything, in the last year and few months that we've been all in lockdowns at various stages, depending on which part of the world that you're in, the pace has only accelerated. So the question, therefore, is that what has changed in the last 50 years? If artificial intelligence has been around for this long, why are some of the issues that we face as a legal community, as professionals in the data privacy area? And what has really changed is, A, the data sets that are available, and B, the computing power that is now available at the hands of technologists. And it's this combination that has enabled the use case development of artificial intelligence, you know, and how it is now getting embraced in every facet of our life. So this exponential increase in computing power is what is putting artificial intelligence in the center of many of the things that we are doing today, both in our individual private lives and in our professional lives as well. The question, therefore, is that, is this combination which makes artificial intelligence, is it a source of a great promise, or are we at the brink of a potential of peril if we don't do things correctly? And, you know, it's a question that I pose to all of you and something that we all need to think about. But if we were to take a lesson from history and go back a few centuries, we will see that history is littered with examples of people who always saw change as the beginning of doomsday, right? You go back as far as Plato, and you know, when human beings started writing, his reaction was, writing is a step backward for truth. And if you think about writing today, it's something that we don't even give a second thought to. Move forward a little bit, and as humanity progressed from writing to printing, writing was seen as the preserve of an activity which was far superior to printing. And printing was rejected by the leading thinkers of that time, saying that the horrible mass of books that keeps growing might lead to a fallback in barbarism. So that's how printing was viewed at. And today, if you think of printing, we don't even give it a second thought. It's there in every aspect of our lives. Fast forward a little bit more, and then you have the wireless technology, which Marconi introduced. And in the 1920s, having introduced this technology, guess what was his struggle? The question he was asking himself was, have I done the world good or have I added a menace? And it continues so on and so forth. In 1943, the CEO of IBM predicted that there is a world market for about 5 computers. And we have the naysayers for artificial intelligence as well, most famously Stephen Hawking's prediction, saying that the development of full AI could spell the end of the human race. And I leave these thoughts with you because we always take lessons from history. And the question we want to ask ourselves is AI going to be different as we embrace it as people? Will history look at us the same way as we look at people who scoffed at writing and printing and wireless and computers? I guess we will not find out, but it also gives us hope that the leading thinkers of the last centuries were wrong about how technology was embraced, and they were wrong by a long shot, right? So having said that, as we go down this path, it's not free from legal and ethical challenges. And, as I mentioned earlier, are we at the brink of a great promise, or is there perils that stare at us? The fact that AI is here and AI is here to stay, I think, is well recognized. The use cases for AI and artificial intelligence are innumerable, right? We all use it every day in our lives when we are using various computer applications seamlessly. As data is churned out, we embrace that data, we use it to our advantage in many, many different facets of the world. And in fact, if you talk to people who are running AI solutions, they are saying that the next big pivot is going to be shift from the AI applications that was happening in business to consumer applications, and it's now going to see its application in the corporations, in the industrial space. So this wave is coming, right? And in the industrial space, we've already seen corporations adopting it, whether it's in the form of management of supply chain, fraud detection, getting to know your customers, healthcare, contract management, and you could go on and on and on. So the question is, if this is here to stay, how do we harness the benefits of this, keeping in mind that it's not free of its challenges? There is this great tension that exists between the benefits of AI and the overall sort of pervasiveness of it. With the question are we as a society ready for the impact that it brings? Are we in a position that we will be able to deal with the legal and ethical challenges that it throws at us? It's predicted that by 2030, the contribution of artificial intelligence to the world economy is going to be $15 trillion. And every day there's news of companies, venture capitalist funds being started in this space. So clearly this is here to stay. The question is, what does it mean for lawyers? And as is not unusual, the legal field often reacts to some of these changes that are taking place. We've seen beginnings of some legislation that has come in to manage artificial intelligence. However, there is much to be said on this subject. The courts are still out. We have not seen a full barrage of legal cases on issues that have debated the nuances of artificial intelligence. This is something that we will see play out as more and more of these use cases get adopted. as challenges are laid forth, as disputes arise between data owners and the owners of artificial intelligence. And how this plays out is something that we'll all have front row seats for. When we think of AI and the legal and ethical challenges, risk, questions, solutions are available at at every sort of part of the life cycle of artificial intelligence, right? Whether it's in the area of problem selection, data selection, algorithm selection, whether we're doing model creation, model training, or even monitoring output. So let's talk about a few of these issues that face us and how it's getting tackled either by legislation, framework, or even contractually, where there is absence of these frameworks. And then the question then becomes that where do you go from here? How will the courts deal with it as these issues mature and reach a point of being challenged in many ways. So let me begin by the problem selection, the cases or the use cases for which AI is being applied. And the first point that is emerging is the proposed EU regulation on AI. It's one of the first more comprehensive frameworks that is being proposed, and it's still about 18 months away. We are not anywhere close to seeing this become effective tomorrow. However, the debate has already started that whether this regulation is going to introduce responsible AI or is it something that's going to stifle innovation? And that's a question that we will see at various junctions as we think of AI and the ethical and legal solutions that it poses. But essentially, what is being proposed by the EU is that as we think of use cases, they have sought to divide and categorize these into different risk areas. There is the category of the unacceptable problem selection, which relates to surveillance or sentiment analysis of biometrics in public areas. The EU is saying it's a no-no. And then we move on to the high-risk areas where you can bring in artificial intelligence, but you've got to do it with some degree of regulation and control. And some of the high-risk areas that have been identified are education and training, for example, when you are scoring exams, healthcare, where you have robot-assisted surgery, hiring, when there's resume sorting. And the idea is that if you're going to introduce artificial intelligence in these high-risk areas, you do this on the back of a risk assessment, traceability of results, a guarantee of security, and then some element of adequate human control. So that's one aspect of where how artificial intelligence will be monitored. And the question then remains that, is EU going to be alone in this journey? Will it be joined by other nations? Will it result in innovation happening more rapidly in other places? Or will we see responsible artificial intelligence coming out of the EU? Similarly, privacy considerations. Now, some of the issues on privacy and the data selection are common, with use of software, both whether it's with artificial intelligence or without that. And you guys are all experts in this, so I don't need to speak to you about that. But the question is that when you start training AI for using those data sets, where is the legal obligation to be transparent about it to the owner of that data? What happens if the data is anonymized? Is there a guarantee of anonymization which gives enough assurance to the data users? Can you use the data that was collected for purpose A, and when it was collected, there was no use case for which this data could be used to bring artificial intelligence solutions? And can you do that without consent? And again, I guess the question depends on what jurisdiction you are in. But clearly, consent remains at the center of some of these issues. What about algorithm selection? Is there transparency in understanding the logic involved in the decision-making process, or are we going to be opaque about it? We've seen examples, everybody talks about them as false positives, where when artificial intelligence is deployed, you get wrong results. We've got the example out of Michigan, where the Unemployment Insurance Agency was deploying AI, and it resulted in people being falsely accused of fraud claims based on AI. There was a legal challenge filed. We still don't know what the outcome is. But again, the debate is that where is the transparency and the way and what logic is being applied to these issues. Moving further down the chain, the issue on IP ownership. Ultimately, artificial intelligence just doesn't look at the software that was created with human intervention, with input and data points, but it's a process that's maturing, as more data sets are being fed into. It's developing on its own. It's weaving out the false positives. So the question is that when this machine learning is applied to these algorithms, who owns the output, who owns the new results? And more importantly, how is that going to be determined? Is the law going to define it? And if the law is silent today, because this is not being generated by human intervention, how do companies apportion these ownership rights? The data owner may be different from the person who's brought the artificial intelligence to the table. The use case may be applied at a third party. What we are seeing early on right now is that as these things are maturing, these issues are becoming sort of the topics of debate and negotiation in contracts, as AI providers are providing solutions, as the data owners are bringing data sets. Corporations are sitting across the table and deciding that who will own the output from the artificial intelligence. And we've seen a rapid maturing of this process, I would say, in the last no more than a couple of years ago, whereas this was an issue that was not given so much attention in contract negotiations. People tended to focus on the more traditional clauses where the debate was on indemnification and limitation of liability. But data rights are now sort of right in the middle of it. And what can that data be used for, right? So again, issues for us to think about. And then from a legal point of view, the big sort of elephant in the room is also liability. If somebody is providing the data, somebody is providing the software that is applying the AI algorithm to it, and it is a combination of those two things that is going to result in an output. And it's not just one thing that is contributing to the outcome, because that same artificial intelligence applied to a different set of data could give you a completely different result. Where does liability lie? Is the liability going to lie with, quote unquote, the artificial intelligence, which by itself has no legal standing? Is it going to lie with the data set owner? Is it going to lie with the owner of the artificial intelligence, the person who developed the system? And again, the person who's developing the artificial intelligence has a duty to care and may be liable if they've acted in an erroneous manner. But what if the result is erroneous because of the way the data was provided, right? So how do we handle these events? We've talked about these black swan events in the industry where an autonomous car takes a decision. Where does liability lie? Are these artificial intelligence, or is this artificial stupidity? Is this something that is going to course correct? and what is it going to leave in its wake. Similarly, you have issues around outcomes. Ultimately, the artificial intelligence is also acting on both the data that is provided to it and the rules that you're setting for it. Are we inputting into these rules the biases of the developers who are developing these rules? We are also inputting into the solution the biases that the data carries. So how is the outcomes going to be regulated? Again, you know, if you think of the examples of bias that have now been that are now being talked about on account of the way artificial intelligence is being applied. There are many, many such examples, right? The bias in the hiring process, how a resume is being sorted out. The bias in insurance rates when people are applying for insurance coverage, or when people are applying for loans, are biases which are rooted in gender, which are rooted in geographical location, ethnicity. How are they getting built into the AI? And how are we going to deal with these biases if they're going to become part of the solution? Are we going to have artificial intelligence that is going to operate in this manner, which creates a playing field which is not level for a certain subcategory of people? Then, you know, there are other issues, again, at the crossroads of law and ethics, issues on cybersecurity. Now, if you think about cybersecurity, it is really not something that, I mean, it's an issue that exists with traditional software as well. But with artificial intelligence, depending on when and how the breach takes place, how do you deal with it? Are you going to have traceability back to how artificial intelligence was introduced in the process? Or is it going to become an integral part of that solution? Can the data breach, in fact, create an error in the solution and in the system itself? Where will all of these issues lie? What about safety? You know, the robustness of the data. People talk about lack of empathy. As human beings, if we continue to interact with bots, what is the long-term impact it's going to have on the human brain? What are the consequences that we are looking at? So, you know, I've raised a whole host of questions. I'm sure as we move forward in this journey, we will see solutions coming in through both legislatures. It may be that the legislative solution may be something like an overall framework that we are seeing in the European Union, or we may see different sectors being regulated by individual entities, as we've seen in the US, right? Where you have for example, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which talks about unbiased data which should be used for credit report management. Or reporting credit scores, or the anonymization of data in the healthcare space with HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. So, you know, the way autonomous cars today are being regulated by safety concerns, is that the way that the world will move forward? Or will we see geographical divides in the way data is handled, with EU bringing in an overarching policy, which they've announced that they will, and other countries either adopting different frameworks, industry-specific, segment-specific frameworks. But I think out of all of this, the one thing that is clear is that this is an issue that we're going to grapple with. And the last point that I'll talk about is that how do companies that are in this process think about artificial intelligence? How do we all pivot to what, you know, we would call as responsible AI, so that we are able to leverage clearly the innumerable benefits that come with it, you know, with automation, things that we couldn't see, we are able to see. the computing power that is now available at our hands without compromising individual security and data privacy concerns. And the way I would like to, the last thought I would like to leave with you is perhaps we need to think about this in a three-dimensional way. People, process, and technology, right? And we put in the right controls, the right processes in each of these areas so that we end up with what is responsible AI. On the people front, will companies now think of hiring AI officers? What is the training that we will give to our employees who work in these areas? Are we going to have human beings in the AI process so that we can watch for some of these issues? Then let's talk about some of the processes, right? Are there going to be standards that are going to be adopted? Will we have traceability and responsibility back as algorithms are introduced? Should there be data sheets and model sheets that companies should use to be able to have some amount of this traceability? How can we be more proactive than reactive? And I guess the last point to all of this is on the technology, that how do we bring in technology to control technology? So are we going to have AI that controls AI at the end of this? Will we have algorithms that can help us deliver to this, deliver this in a responsible way so that we harness the power and at the same time are able to manage some of the potential fallouts from this? So with that, I see that Srini and Rajesh have also joined. I can see both of them. Back to you, Rajesh, and to you, Srini.
Thank you very much, Manrupit. A very insightful session. I think it's great where you covered almost all the areas of where AI has its impact and has been seen potentially from a legal standpoint. And literally, to your question, I was almost, even though in the chat I did answer it as 1950s, I think it was the Dartmouth summer project which started some way back in 1956. I think that's the first. So hopefully I'll get some kind of candy after that. But
we'll keep your data private. How's that?
Yes. Thank you. So over to you, Srini, for your inputs and valuable points.
I'm audible?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Rajesh. Hi, Inderpreet. Thanks for that informative session. You covered it various aspects very well. Not only privacy, of course, it's closely related to safety. The human related aspects of how do they have empathy, do they have sentience? So all those aspects are not easy to answer, and obviously I think it will trigger more thoughts and questions than answers, you rightly said. So I wanted to just bring one more perspective which keeps coming in. Rajesh, I presume not many questions. I can take a minute or two, right? Yeah. Should innovation be regulated? Inderpreet, this question keeps coming in conferences and several other places that we interact. And when we talk of innovation, AI comes to our mind. The entire digital technologies, AI is the most important innovation. Every day we come across newer use cases. So we see the analogy that comes to our mind is immediately, I think the innovation cannot be regulated. It is the adoption of innovation that needs to be regulated. So if you take example of in the history of technology development, if you see nuclear fusion, I think nuclear fusion is what we use in predominantly in our nuclear reactors to generate power, and it has a dark side on atomic bombs. So if we had regulated innovation, we would not have had replicated what happens in the solar. Although what happens in the sun is fusion, what we use here is fission. But we could have just because we invested in that, today we have huge renewable energy that is generated. Similarly, if you see cloning, cloning has a dark side. Do you want to do human cloning? But at the same time, genetic cloning has genetically modified crops are useful, right? And it's also used in curing certain diseases. So all this brings us to the point that it is the adoption which industry uses when they adopt in their use cases that one needs to be looking at the aspects of regulation, ethics, fairness, and the issue that we face in AI particularly is that the regulation is always has to catch up with technology. It's always, I think, one step, two step behind technology, and that's going to be the truth always, because we don't expect every thing to be documented and what is right and wrong, and that's where the space is filled by ethics. So I think we need to look forward to yesterday, and we were discussing in various sessions. Trevor was also there about accountability on data controllers and rely on evaluation of fairness, what is fairness, and of course we will see precedences coming from the courts, which will help us to gradually improve on as we come across new innovative cases. We'll always see what is the right thing and wrong thing, and that's how we learn going forward. But we should not be expecting the regulations to be prescribing what is right and wrong, and use our own ethical standards, where I think the regulation that's coming up in Europe, etc., will be doing a long justice. That's what I would like to sum up with. And personally, I'm happy with AI as long as it doesn't replace data privacy professionals. To close my comment with, once again, thank you, Indrapreet. Rajesh, any other point that has come up?
There's one question that is also, owing to the proliferation of AI in high-risk areas, the pressure is mounting to design and govern AI to be accountable, fair, and transparent. So how can this be achieved and through which frameworks? Any kind of insights? Indrapreet, Srini, anybody would like to take that question?
Go ahead, Srini.
Sorry, Rajesh, I could not, some reason I could not see the question. Can you please repeat quickly?
So, owing to the proliferation of AI in high-risk areas, the pressure is mounting to design and govern AI to be accountable, fair, and transparent. How can this be achieved and through which frameworks? So, I think probably the question is more towards, the recent adoption of GDPR or privacy by design and other stuff. So,
right.
Your inputs.
Pretty much right. You're all right. I think we need to, when we are doing privacy by design, it is important to privacy by design, GDPR principles, to take an example, do cover many of these aspects of data minimization, accuracy. So we were in fact doing an exercise when we were developing guidelines in ISO committee of mapping various principles of GDPR, etc., to AI related aspects. What are the harms caused, and we figured out that about 4 to 5 principles directly map to AI, including accuracy, minimization, including security, processing purpose. So during privacy by design exercise, it's our duty to see that we evolve the guidelines to handle AI related aspects into that with the right kind of use cases. And there is a database of use cases, but this keeps coming up. Our engineers, privacy engineers' role would be to keep these guidelines updated.
Thanks, Srini. I think the new concept of ethical AI by design, because whereby imbibing ethics also as part of one of the most important aspects, because ethics and privacy, they walk, most probably along. It's something which is can't be replaced with both. I think that's also getting a much of a major attention, and probably with the AI regulations and the OECD guidelines, I think this would really be one of some of the frameworks that can be, and it needs to be well tested. But I think that's almost a lot of organizations, a lot of countries have started taking major initiatives on this. And we did hear a lot of the other speakers also talk about it, specific projects running in University of Oxford and other universities, specifically on this subject. And it's going to be quite interesting and quite I think, but however, as you said, you can't replace humans, but definitely there are certain things which definitely will have a kind of a key issue. I don't have any further questions, so I would like to take this opportunity to thank Indrapreet for taking a time and a wonderful session, and it's really quite insightful. Thank you very much, Indrapreet. And I would also like to thank all the speakers who have been, in today's sessions, and which were like the sessions which are more informative and insights. And I'm sure the audiences would definitely be happy to take certain key takeaway points that they can use it from a day-to-day perspective. And tomorrow's theme is more about privacy by design and privacy engineering. I look forward to meet you back soon, very soon. So kindly please watch in for the updates, and look forward to see you soon. Thank you. Take care and stay safe until then. Bye.